The Age of Aquarius. In this book we shall find an almost complete list of the conspirators, their institutions, fronts and publications. In 1980 the Aquarian conspiracy was in full swing and its success can be seen in every facet of our private and national life. The overwhelming rise in mindless violence, serial killers, teenage suicides, the unmistakable signs of lethargy, long-range penetration is a part of our new environment, as dangerous, if not more so, than the polluted air that we breathe. The coming of the Age of Aquarius caught America totally unprepared. We, as a nation, were not prepared for the changes about to be forced upon us. Whoever had heard of Tavistock, Kurt Lewin, Willis Harman and John Rawlings Rees? They were not even on the American political scene. What we would have noticed, if we bothered to look at all, was a falling off of our ability to withstand futuristic shock as we became more fatigued, distressed and eventually entered a period of psychological shock followed by widespread apathy as an outward manifestation of long-range penetration warfare. The Age of Aquarius was best described by Tavistock Institute as the vehicle for delivering turbulence. There are three distinct phases, in the response and reaction to stress, displayed by large social groups. First, there is superficiality. The population under attack will defend itself with slogans. This does not identify the source of the crisis and therefore does nothing to address it, hence the crisis will persist. The second is fragmentation. This occurs as the crisis continues and social order breaks down. Then, there is the third phase where the population group goes into self-realization and turns away from the induced crisis and there follows a maladaptive response, accompanied with active synoptic idealism and disassociation. Who can deny that with a huge increase in drug usage, crack making thousands of instant new addicts each day, the shocking rise in the murder of infants each day, aborticide, which by now far exceeds casualties suffered by our armed forces in both world wars, Korea and Vietnam, the open acceptance of homosexuality and lesbianism, whose rights are protected by more and more laws each year, the terrible plague we call AIDS, washing over our towns and cities, total failure of our education system, the stunning increase in the divorce rate, a murder rate that shocks the rest of the world into disbelief, satanic serial killings, the disappearance of thousands of young children, snatched off our streets by perverts, a virtual tidal wave of pornography accompanied by permissiveness on our television screens. Who can deny that this nation is in crisis, which we are not addressing and from which we are turning away? Well-meaning people who specialize in these things blame a lot of the problem on education, or what passes for it in the United States. Criminals now abound in the age groups 9-15. Rapists are quite commonly as young as 10. Our social specialists, our teachers' unions, our churches say it is all due to a faulty education system. Witness how test scores keep dropping. The specialists bewail the fact that the United States now ranks around 39th in the level of education in the world. Why do we bemoan what is so obvious? Our education system was programmed to self-destruct. That was what Dr. Alexander King was sent here by NATO to arrange. That is what Justice Hugo Black was ordered to arrange. The fact is, that the Committee of 300, with the approval of our government, does not want our youth to be properly educated. The education that Freemason Justice Hugo Black, Alexander King, Gunnar Middle and his wife came to give the children of the United States is that crime pays, expediency is what counts. They taught our children that United States law is unequally appled, and that is perfectly in order. Our children were properly educated by a decade of corrupt examples. Ronald Reagan and George Bush were ruled by greed and became totally corrupted by it. Our education system hasn't failed. Under the guidance of King, Black and the Middles it is actually a great success, but it all depends from whose point of view we look at it. The Committee of 300 is delighted with our education system, and will not allow one comma of it to be changed. According to Stanford and Willis Harman, the induced trauma of long-range penetration of which our education is a part, has been going on for 45 years, Yet how many are aware of the insidious pressures being applied to our society and the constant exposure to brainwashing that goes on every day? The mysterious gang wars that broke out in New York in the 1950s is an example of how the conspirators can create and stage manage any type of disruptive elements they like. Where those gang wars came from nobody knew until the 1980s, when researchers uncovered the hidden controllers who directed the so-called social phenomena. Gang wars were carefully planned at Stanford, deliberately designed to shock society and cause ripples of disturbances. By 1958 there were in excess of 200 of these gangs. They were made popular by a musical and a Hollywood movie, West Side Story. After making the news for a decade, suddenly, in 1966, they disappeared off the streets of New York, Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia and Chicago. Throughout the near decade of gang violence, the public reacted according to the profiled response Stanford expected. Society as a whole could not comprehend gang warfare and the public responded in a maladaptive manner. Had there been those wise enough to recognize in gang wars a Stanford experiment in social engineering and brainwashing, the conspirators' plot would have been exposed. Either we did not have trained specialists who could see what was going on, which is highly unlikely, or they were threatened and remained silent. The cooperation with Stanford by the news media brought to light a new age attack on our environment, just as predicted by the social engineers and new science scientists at Tavistock. In 1989, gang warfare, as a social conditioning to change, was reintroduced to the streets of Los Angeles. Within a few short months of the first incidents, gangs began to proliferate, first in the scores, then in the hundreds on the streets of the east side of Los Angeles. Crack houses and rampant prostitution proliferated, drug dealers dominated the streets. Anybody who got in their way was gunned down. The outcry in the press was loud and long. Stanford's targeted large population group began defending itself with slogans. This is what Tavistock called the first phase, with the targeted group failing to identify the source of the crisis. The second phase of the gang war crisis was fragmentation. People not living in the areas frequented by gangs said, "Thank God they are not in our neighborhood." This ignored the fact that the crisis continued with or without recognition and that social order in Los Angeles had begun to break down. As profiled by Tavistock, those groups not affected by gang war broke away to defend themselves because the source of the crisis was not identified, the so-called maladaptation process, the period of disassociation. Apart from the proliferation of drug sales, what is the purpose of gang wars? First, it is to show the targeted group that they are not safe, that is, insecurity is generated. Secondly, it is to show that organized society is helpless in the face of such violence, and thirdly to bring about a recognition of the fact that our social order is collapsing. The present wave of gang violence will go away just as quickly as it started, once the 3 phases of the Stanford program are completed. An outstanding example of social conditioning to accept change, even when it is recognized as unwelcome change by the large population group in the sites of Stanford Research Institute, was the advent of the Beatles. The Beatles were brought to the United States as part of a social experiment which would subject large population groups to brainwashing of which they were not even aware. When Tavistock brought the Beatles to the United States, nobody could have imagined the cultural disaster that was to follow in their wake. The Beatles were an integral part of the Aquarian conspiracy, a living organism which sprang from the changing images of man. URH 489 2150 Policy Research Report No. 4 April 1974. Policy Report prepared by SRI Center for the Study of Social Policy. Director, Professor Willis Harman. The phenomenon of the Beatles was not a spontaneous rebellion by youth against the old social system. Instead, it was a carefully crafted plot to introduce, by a conspiratorial body which could not be identified, a highly destructive and divisive element into a large population group targeted for change against its will. New words and new phrases, prepared by Tavistock, were introduced to America along with the Beatles. Words such as rock in relation to music sounds, teenager, cool, discovered and pop music were a lexicon of disguised code words signifying the acceptance of drugs, and they arrived with and accompanied the Beatles wherever they went, to be discovered by teenagers. Incidentally, the word teenagers was never used until just before the Beatles arrived on the scene, courtesy of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. He's right about the word teenager being invented by they, and the reason why the term was invented, divide and conquer. He's wrong about the time period, though. The concept of the teenager came about during the 1950s, along with phrases such as cool, rock and roll, etc. Bill Haley and Elvis Presley came along, long before the Beatles. As in the case of gang wars, nothing could or would have been accomplished without the cooperation of the media, especially the electronic media and, in particular, the scurrilous Ed Sullivan, who had been coached by the conspirators as to the role he was to play. Nobody would have paid much attention to the motley crew from Liverpool and the 12-atonal system of music that was to follow had it not been for an overabundance of press exposure. The 12-atonal system consisted of heavy, repetitive sounds, taken from the music of the cult of Dionysus and the Baal priesthood by Adorno and given a modern flavor by this special friend of the Queen of England and hence to the Committee of 300. Tavistock and its Stanford Research Center created trigger words which then came into general usage around rock music and its fans. Trigger words created a distinct new breakaway, largely young, population group which was persuaded by social engineering and conditioning to believe that the Beatles really were their favorite group. All trigger words devised in the context of rock music were designed for mass control of the new targeted group, the youth of America. The Beatles did a perfect job, or perhaps it would be more correct to say that Tavistock and Stanford did a perfect job, the Beatles merely reacting like trained robots with a little help from their friends, code words for using drugs and making it cool. The Beatles became a highly visible new type, more Tavistock jargon, and as such it was not long before the group made new styles, fads in clothing, hairstyles and language usage, which upset the older generation, as was intended. This was part of the fragmentation maladaptation process worked out by Willis Harman and his team of social scientists and genetic engineering tinkerers and put into action. The role of the print and electronic media in our society is crucial to the success of brainwashing large population groups. Gang wars ended in Los Angeles in 1966 as the media withdrew its coverage. The same thing will happen with the current wave of gang wars in Los Angeles. Street gangs will wither on the vine once media saturation coverage is toned down and then completely withdrawn. As in 1966, the issue would become burned out. Street gangs will have served their purpose of creating turbulence and insecurity. Exactly the same pattern will be followed in the case of rock music. Deprived of media attention, it will eventually take its place in history. Following the Beatles, who incidentally were put together by the Tavistock Institute, came other made-in-England rock groups, who, like the Beatles, had Theo Adorno write their cult lyrics and compose all the music. I hate to use these beautiful words in the context of Beatlemania. It reminds me of how wrongly the word lover is used when referring to the filthy interaction between two homosexuals writhing in pig's will. To call rock music is an insult, likewise the language used in rock lyrics. Tavistock and Stanford Research then embarked on the second phase of the work commissioned by the Committee of 300. This new phase turned up the heat for social change in America. As quickly as the Beatles had appeared on the American scene, so too did the Beat Generation, trigger words designed to separate and fragment society. The media now focused its attention on the Beat Generation. Other Tavistock-coined words came seemingly out of nowhere. Beatniks, hippies, flower children became part of the vocabulary of America. It became popular to drop out and wear dirty jeans, go about with long unwashed hair. The Beat Generation cut itself off from mainstream America. They became just as infamous as the cleaner Beatles before them. The newly created group and its lifestyle swept millions of young Americans into the cult. American youth underwent a radical revolution without ever being aware of it, while the older generation stood by helplessly, unable to identify the source of the crisis, and thus reacting in a maladaptive manner against its manifestation, which were drugs of all types, marijuana, and later lysergic acid, LSD, so conveniently provided for them by the Swiss pharmaceutical company, Sandoz, following the discovery by one of its chemists, Albert Hofmann, how to make synthetisigketamine, a powerful mind-altering drug. The Committee of 300 financed the project through one of their banks, S.C. Warburg, and the drug was carried to America by the philosopher, Aldous Huxley. The new wonder drug was promptly distributed in sample-size packages, handed out free of charge on college campuses across the United States and at rock concerts, which became the leading vehicle for proliferating the use of drugs. The question that cries out for an answer is, what was the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, doing at the time? There is compelling circumstantial evidence that would appear to indicate that the DEA knew what was going on but was ordered not to take any action. With very substantial numbers of new British rock bands arriving in the US, rock concerts began to become a fixture on the social calendar of American youth. In tandem with these concerts, the use of drugs among the youth rose in proportion. The devilish bedlam of discordant heavy beat sounds numbed the minds of listeners so that they were easily persuaded to try the new drug on the basis that everybody is doing it. Peer pressure is a very strong weapon. The new culture received maximum coverage from the jackal media, which cost the conspirators not one single thin dime. Great anger was felt by a number of civic leaders and churchmen over the new cult, but their energies were misdirected against the result of what was going on and not against the cause. Critics of the rock cult made the same mistakes that had been made in the Prohibition era. They criticized law enforcement agencies, teachers, parents, anybody but the conspirators. Because of the anger and resentment I feel toward the great drug plague, I make no apology for using language which is not customary for me to use. One of the worst drug slobs ever to walk the streets of America was Allen Ginsberg. This Ginsberg pushed the use of LSD through advertising which cost him nothing, although under normal circumstances it would have cost millions of dollars in TV advertising revenues. This free advertising for drugs, and LSD in particular, reached a new high in the late 1960s, thanks to the ever-willing cooperation of the media. The effect of Ginsberg's mass advertising campaign was devastating. The American public was subjected to one cultural future shock after another in rapid succession. We became overexposed and overstimulated and, again, may I remind you that this is Tavistock jargon, lifted from the Tavistock training manual, overwhelmed by its new development, and, when we reached that point, our minds began to lapse into apathy. It was just too much to cope with, that is to say, long-range penetration had taken hold of us. Ginsberg claimed to be a poet, but no greater rubbish was ever written by anyone who ever aspired to becoming a poet. Ginsberg's designated task had little to do with poetry. His main function was to push the new subculture and force acceptance of it upon the large targeted population group. To assist him in his task, Ginsberg co-opted the services of Norman Mailer, a writer of sorts who had spent some time in a mental institution. Mailer was a favorite of the left-wing Hollywood crowd and so had no problem with getting maximum television time for Ginsberg. Naturally, Mailer had to have a pretext. Not even he could blatantly come out with the true nature of Ginsberg's television appearances. So a charade was adopted. Mailer would talk seriously on camera with Ginsberg about poetry and literature. This method of getting wide television coverage at no cost to themselves was followed by every rock group and concert promoter who followed the example set by Ginsberg. The electronic media moguls had big hearts when it came to giving free time to these dirty verminous creatures and their even dirtier products and filthy ideas. Their promotion of horrible garbage spoke volumes, and, without abundant help from the print and electronic media, the drug trade could not have spread as rapidly as it did in the late 1960s to early 1970s, and probably would have been confined to a few small local areas. Ginsberg was able to give several nationally televised performances extolling the virtues of LSD and marijuana, under the guise of new ideas and new cultures developing in the art and music world. Not to be outdone by the electronic media, Ginsberg's admirers wrote glowing articles about this colorful man in the art and social columns of all of America's largest newspapers and magazines. There had never been such an across-the-media board-free advertising campaign in the history of newspaper, radio and television, and it cost the promoters of the Aquarian conspiracy, NATO and the Club of Rome not one red cent. It was all absolutely free advertising for LSD, only thinly disguised as art and culture. One of Ginsberg's closest friends, Kenny Love, published a 5-page report in the New York Times. This is in accordance with the methodology used by Tavistock and Stanford research. If something is to be promoted which the public has not yet been fully brainwashed to accept, then have someone write an article, covering all sides of the subject matter. The other method is to have live television talk shows in which a panel of experts promotes the product and/or idea under the pretext of discussing it. There are point and counterpoint, both pro and con participants airing their support or opposition. When it is all over, the subject to be promoted has been dinned into the public mind. While this was new in the early 1970s, today it is standard practice on which talk shows thrive. Love's 5-page pro-LSD pro-Ginsberg article was duly printed by the New York Times. Had Ginsberg tried to buy the same amount of space in an advertisement, it would have cost him at least $50,000. But Ginsberg didn't have to worry. Thanks to his friend Kenny Love, Ginsberg got the massive advertising all for free. With newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post under the control of the Committee of 300, this kind of free advertising is given to any subject matter, and more especially to those promoting decadent lifestyles, drugs, hedonism, anything that will confuse the American people. After the trial run with Ginsberg and LSD, it became standard Club of Rome practice to call upon major newspapers in America to give free advertising on demand to people and ideas they were promoting. Worse yet, or better yet, depending upon the viewpoint, United Press, picked up Kenny Love's free advertising for Ginsberg and LSD and telexed it to hundreds of newspapers and magazines around the country under the guise of a news story. Even such highly respectable establishment magazines as Harper's Bazaar and Time made Mr. Ginsberg respectable. If a nationwide campaign of this magnitude were presented to Ginsberg and the promoters of LSD by an advertising agency, the price tag would have run into at least $1 million in terms of $1970. Today the price tag would be nothing less than $16 million. It is no wonder that I refer to the news media as jackals. I suggest that we try to find any media outlet to do an expose on the Federal Reserve Board, which is what I did. I took my article, which was a good expose of the greatest swindle on earth, to every major newspaper, radio and television station, magazine house and several talk show hosts. A few made promises that sounded good. They would definitely air the article and have me discuss it. Give them about a week and they would get back to me. Not one of them ever did, nor did my article ever appear in the pages of their newspapers and journals. It was as if a blanket of silence had been thrown over me and the subject I was endeavoring to promote, and indeed that was precisely what had happened. Without massive media hype, and without almost around-the-clock coverage, the hippie beatnik rock, drug cult would never have gotten off the ground. It would have remained a localized oddity. The Beatles, with their twanging guitars, silly expressions, drug language and weird clothes, would not have amounted to a hill of beans. Instead, because the Beatles were given saturation coverage by the media, the United States has suffered one cultural shock after another. The men buried in the think tanks and research institutions, whose names and faces are still not known to but a few people, made sure that the press played its part. Conversely, the media's important role in not exposing the power behind the future cultural shocks made certain that the source of the crisis was never identified. Thus was our society driven mad through psychological shocks and stress. Driven Mad is taken from Tavistock's training manual. From its modest beginnings in 1921, Tavistock was ready in 1966 to launch a major irreversible cultural revolution in America, which has not yet ended. The Aquarian conspiracy is part of it. Thus softened up, our nation was now deemed ripe for the introduction of drugs which was to rival the Prohibition era in scope and the huge amounts of money to be made. This too was an integral part of the Aquarian conspiracy. The proliferation of drug usage was one of the subjects under study at the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU, at Tavistock's Sussex University facility. It was known as the Future Shocks Center, a title given to so-called future-oriented psychology designed to manipulate whole population groups to induce future shocks. It was the first of several such institutions set up by Tavistock. Future shocks is described as a series of events which come so fast that the human brain cannot absorb the information. As I said earlier, science has shown that there are clearly marked limits to the amount of changes and the nature of them that the mind can deal with. After continuous shocks, the large targeted population group discovers that it does not want to make choices anymore. Apathy takes over, often preceded by mindless violence such as is characteristic of the Los Angeles street gangs, serial killers, rapists and child kidnappers. Such a group becomes easy to control and will docilely follow orders without rebelling, which is the object of the exercise. Future shocks, says SPRU, is defined as physical and psychological distress arising from the excess load on the decision-making mechanism of the human mind. That is Tavistock jargon lifted straight from Tavistock manuals, which they don't know I have. Just as an overloaded electrical circuit will activate a trip switch, so do humans trip out, which is a syndrome that medical science is only now beginning to understand, although John Rawlings Rees conducted experiments in this field as far back as the 1920s. As can be appreciated, such a targeted group is ready to trip out and take to drugs as a means of escape from the pressures of so many choices having to be made. This is how drug usage was spread so rapidly through America's Beat generation. What started with the Beatles and sample packages of LSD has grown into a floodtide of drug usage which is swamping America. The drug trade is controlled by the Committee of 300 from the top down. The drug trade started with the British East India Company and was closely followed by the Dutch East India Company. Both were controlled by a council of 300 inches. The list of names of members and stockholders of the Beak read like something out of Debrett's Peerage. Beak established the China Inland Mission, whose job it was to get the Chinese peasants, or coolies, as they were called, addicted to opium. This created the market for opium which the Beak then filled. In much the same way that the Committee of 300 used the Beatles to popularize social drugs with the youth of America and the Hollywood in crowd. Ed Sullivan was sent to England to become acquainted with the first Tavistock Institute rock group to hit the shores of the United States. Sullivan then returned to the United States to draft the strategy for the electronic media on how to package and sell the group. Without the full cooperation of the electronic media and Ed Sullivan, in particular, the Beatles and their music would have died on the vine. Instead, our national life and the character of the United States was forever changed. Now that we know, it is all too clear how successful the Beatles' campaign to proliferate the use of drugs became. The fact that the Beatles had their music and lyrics written for them by Theo Adorno was concealed from public view. The prime function to the Beatles was to be discovered by teenagers, who were then subjected to a non-stop barrage of Beatle music, until they became convinced that they liked the sound and adopted it, along with all that accompanied it. The Liverpool group performed up to expectations, and with a little help from their friends, that is, illegal substances we call drugs, created a whole new class to young Americans in the precise mold ordained by the Tavistock Institute. Tavistock had created a highly visible new type to act as their drug runners. The China Inland Mission Christian missionaries would not have fitted in with the 1960s. New type is social science scientist jargon. What it meant was that the Beatles created new social patterns, first and foremost being to normalize and popularize the use of drugs, new tastes in clothes and hairstyles which really distinguished them from the older generation as was intended by Tavistock. It is important to note the deliberate fragmentation-inducing language used by Tavistock. The teenagers never once dreamed that all the different things they aspired to were the product of older scientists working in think tanks in England and Stanford research. How mortified they would have been if they had discovered that most of their cool habits and expressions were deliberately created for their use by a group of older social science scientists. The role of the media was, and remains, very important in promoting the use of drugs on a nationwide scale. When coverage of the street warfare gangs was abruptly terminated by the media, they became burned out as a social phenomena. The new age of drugs followed. The media has always served as a catalyst and has always pushed new causes, and now media attention was focused on drug usage and its supporters, the Beat Generation, yet another phrase fashioned at Tavistock, in its determined efforts to bring about social changes in the United States. Drug usage now became an accepted part of everyday life in America. This Tavistock design program took in millions of American youth, and the older generation began to believe that America was undergoing a natural social revolution, failing all the while to realize that what was happening to their children was not a spontaneous movement, but a highly artificial creation designed to force changes in America's social and political life. The descendants of the British East India Company were delighted with the success of their drug-pushing program. Their disciples became adept in the use of lysergic acid, LSD, so conveniently made available by patrons of the drug trade like Aldous Huxley, courtesy of the highly respected Sandoz Company of Switzerland and financed by the great Warburg banking dynasty. The new wonder drug was promptly distributed at all rock concerts and on college campuses in free sample packages. The question that begs to be asked is, what was the FBI doing while all this was going on? The purpose of the Beatles had become abundantly clear. The British East India Company's descendants in the upper-class society in London must have felt very good about the billions of dollars that began rolling in. With the coming of rock, which shall henceforth be used as shorthand to describe Adorno's fiendish satanic music, a tremendous increase in the use of social drugs, especially marijuana, was observed. The entire dope business was expanded under the control and direction of the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU. SPRU was run by Leland Bradford, Kenneth Dam and Ronald Lippert, under whose expert guidance a large number of new scientists were trained to promote future shocks, one of the chief being the dramatic increase in the use of drugs by America's teenagers. SPRU's policy papers, planted in various government agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, dictated the course of the disastrous drug war allegedly waged by the Reagan and Bush administrations. This was the forerunner of how the United States is run today, by one committee and or council after another, by an inner government fed on Tavistock papers which they firmly believe are their own opinions. These virtual unknowns are making decisions that will forever change our form of government and the quality of life here in the United States. Through crisis adaptation we have already been changed so much as to barely compare with what we were in the 1950s. Also, our environment has been changed. There is much talk about environment these days and, while it mostly refers to green surroundings, pure rivers and fresh air, there is another, equally important environment, namely, the drug environment. The environment of our lifestyle has become polluted, our thinking has become polluted. Our ability to control our destiny has become polluted. We are confronted by changes that pollute our thinking to the extent that we do not know what to make of it all. The environment of change is crippling the nation. We appear to have so little control that it has produced anxiety and confusion. We now look to group solutions instead of individual solutions to our problems. We do not make use of our own resources to solve problems. In this the prolific rise in drug usage is playing a leading role. The strategy is a deliberate one, devised by the new scientists, the social engineers and tinkerers, aimed at the most vulnerable of all areas, our self-image, or how we perceive ourselves, which leads us eventually to become like sheep, we the sheeple, being led to the slaughter. We have become confused by the many choices we have to make, and we have become apathetic. We are manipulated by unscrupulous men without ever being aware of it. This is particularly true of the drug trade, and we are now in the transition stage where we can be set up for a change from the present constitutional form of government, which has taken a giant step forward under the Bush administration. While there are those who still persist, in the face of all of the evidence to the contrary, in saying, it can't happen in America, the fact is, it has already happened. Our will to resist events not to our liking has been steadily eroded and undermined. We will resist, some of us say, but not so many of us will do that, and we will be in the minority. The drug trade has insidiously changed our environment. The alleged war on drugs is a farce. It does not exist in qualitative measure to make the slightest difference to the descendants of the British East India Company. Combined with computerization, we are almost fully brainwashed, robbed of our ability to resist forced changes. Which brings us to another environment, people control, also known as personal information control, without which governments cannot play their numbers game. As matters stand, we the people have absolutely no way of knowing just what government does or does not know about us. Government computer files are not subject to scrutiny by the public at large. Do we foolishly believe that personal information is sacrosanct? Remember, in every society there are rich and powerful families who control law enforcement agencies. I have proved the existence of such families. Do not think that if these families wanted to find out about us, they could not do so. These are the families who often have a member in the Committee of 300. Take Kissinger, for instance, who has his own private dossiers on hundreds of thousands of people, not only in the US but all over the world. Are we on Kissinger's enemy list? Is this far-fetched? Not at all. Take P2 Masonic and Committee Monte Carlo, who have such lists which run into tens of thousands of names. Incidentally, Kissinger is one of them. There are other private intelligence agencies, such as Intel, whom we shall meet later. One of the ways heroin is moved into Europe is through the Principality of Monaco. The heroin comes from Corsica, carried in ferries that ply a busy trade between Corsica and Monte Carlo during the summer. There is no check of what goes on or comes off these ferries. As there is no border between France and Monaco, drugs, and more especially heroin, partly processed opium, flows through the open border of Monaco into laboratories in France, or else if it has already been processed into heroin, it goes directly to the distributors. The Grimaldi family has been in the drug smuggling business for centuries. Because Prince Rainier got greedy and began skimming heavily and would not desist after 3 warnings, his wife, Princess Grace, was murdered in a car accident. Rainier underestimated the power of the committee of which he is a member. The Rover car in which she was traveling had the brake fluid chambers tampered with in such a way that each time the brakes were depressed, fluid was released in measured amount, until by the time the car reached the most dangerous of several hairpin bends, there was no stopping power, and it sailed over a stone wall, hitting the ground 50 feet below in a sickening smash. Everything possible was done by the Committee of 300 operatives to conceal the truth about the murder of Princess Grace. To this day the Rover car remains in the custody of French police, shrouded under a cover on a trailer which no one is allowed to approach, let alone examine. The signal for the execution of Princess Grace was picked up by the British Army listening post in Cyprus, and it is believed by a well-placed source that the Committee Monte Carlo and P2 gave the order. The drug trade, controlled by the Committee of 300, is a crime against humanity. But having been conditioned and softened up by years of incessant bombardment by Tavistock Institute, we have more or less accepted our changed environment, regarding the drug trade as a problem that is too big to handle. This is not the case. If we could marshal an entire nation, equip and send millions of American soldiers to fight in a war in Europe in which we had no business intervening, if we could defeat a major power, then we can smash the drug trade, using the same World War II tactics. The logistical problems that had to be solved when we entered the Second World War are even today still mind-boggling. Yet we successfully overcame all problems. Why then is it impossible to defeat a well-defined enemy, far smaller and weaker than Germany, given the immensely improved weapons and surveillance equipment we have today? The real reason that the drug problem is not eradicated is because it is being run by the highest families in the entire world as part of a coordinated gigantic money-making machine. In 1930, British capital invested in South America greatly exceeded capital investment in British dominions. Graham, an authority on British investments abroad, stated that British investment in South America exceeded £1 trillion. Remember, this was 1930, and £1 trillion was a staggering sum of money in those days. What was the reason for such heavy investment in South America? In a word, it was drugs. The plutocracy controlling British banks held the purse strings and then, as now, put up a most respectable facade to cover their true business. No one ever caught them with dirtied hands. They always had front men, even as they do today, willing to take the blame if things went awry. Then, as now, the connections with the drug trade were tenuous at best. No one was ever able to lay a finger on the respectable and noble banking families of Britain, whose members are on the Committee of 300. There is great significance in that only 15 members of Parliament were the controllers of that vast empire, of which the most prominent were Sir Charles Barry and the Chamberlain family. These overlords of finance were busy in places like Argentina, Jamaica and Trinidad, which became big money spinners for them through the drug trade. In these countries, British plutocrats kept the locals, as they were contemptuously called, at bare subsistence levels, hardly above slavery. The fortunes extracted from the drug trade in the Caribbean were vast. The plutocrats hid behind faces like Trinidad Leaseholds Limited, but the real meat, then, as now, was drugs. This is true of today, where we find that Jamaica's gross national product, GNP, is made up almost entirely of sales of ganja, a very potent form of marijuana. The mechanism for handling the ganja trade was set up by David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger under the title Caribbean Basin Initiative. Up until a relatively short time ago, the true history of the China opium trade was quite unknown, having been as well covered up as it is possible to do. Many of my former students in the days while I was lecturing, would come and ask me why the Chinese were so fond of smoking opium. They were puzzled, as are many still today, over contradictory accounts of what had actually taken place in China. Most thought it was merely a case of the Chinese workers buying opium on an open market and smoking it, or going to some of the thousands of opium dens and forgetting their terrible existence for a while. The truth is that the supply of opium to China was a British monopoly, an official monopoly of the British government and official British policy. The Indo-British opium trade in China was one of the best-kept secrets, around which many misleading legends grew up, such as Clive of India and the tales of daring-do, valor, by the British Army in India for the glory of the empire, so well written by Rudyard Kipling, and tales of tea clippers racing across the oceans with their cargoes of Chinata for the high society drawing rooms of Victorian England. In reality, the history of British occupation of India and Britain's opium wars are some of the most dastardly blots on Western civilization. Almost 13% of the income of India under British rule was derived from the sale of good quality Bengal opium to the British-run opium distributors in China. The Beatles of the day, the China Inland Mission, Christian missionaries, had done a great job in proliferating the use of opium among the poor Chinese laborers, coolies, as they were called. These addicts did not suddenly materialize out of thin air, any more than did teenager addicts in the US. The point to remember is that both were created. In China, a market for opium was first created and then filled by opium from Bengal. In the same way, a market for marijuana and LSD was first created in the United States by methods already described, and then filled by British plutocrats and their American cousins with the help of the overlords of the British banking establishment. The lucrative drug trade is one of the worst examples of making money out of human misery, the other being the legal drug trade run by the pharmaceutical drug houses under Rockefeller ownership, in the US for the most part, but with substantial companies operating in Switzerland, France and Britain and fully backed by the American Medical Association, AMA. The dirty dope transactions and the money it generates flows through the city of London, together with Hong Kong, Dubai and latterly, Lebanon, thanks to the invasion of that country by Israel. There will be those who doubt this statement. Look at the business columns of the Financial Times, they will tell us. Don't tell me that this is all related to drug money. Of course it is, but don't imagine for 1 minute that the noble lords and ladies of England are going to advertise the fact. Remember the British East India Company? Officially, its business was trading in tea. The London Times never dared tell the British public that it was impossible to make vast profits from tea, nor did the illustrious paper even hint at a trade in opium being plied by those who spent their time in London's fashionable clubs or playing a chukker of polo at the Royal Windsor Club, or that the gentlemen officers who went out to India in the service of the Empire were financed solely by the enormous income derived from the misery of the millions of Chinese coolies addicted to opium. The trade was conducted by the illustrious British East India Company, whose meddling in political, religious and economic affairs of the United States has cost us very dearly for over 200 years. The 300 members of the British East India Company's board were a cut above the common herd. They were so mighty, as Lord Bertrand Russell once observed, they could even give God advice when he had trouble in heaven. Nor should we imagine that anything has changed in the intervening years. Exactly the same attitude prevails today among members of the Committee of 300, which is why they often refer to themselves as the Olympians. Later the British Crown, that is, the royal family, joined the British East India Company's trade, and used it as a vehicle to produce opium in Bengal, and elsewhere in India, controlling exports through what was called transit duties, that is, the Crown levied a tax on all producers of opium duly registered with the state authority, who were sending their opium to China. Prior to 1896, when the trade was still illegal, a word used to extract greater tribute from the producers of opium, there never having been the slightest attempt to stop the trade, colossal amounts of opium were shipped out of India on board China tea clippers, those sailing ships around which legend and lore were built, which supposedly carried chests of tea from India and China to the London exchanges. So audacious did the British East India Company lords and ladies become that they tried to sell this lethal substance to the Union and Confederate armies in pill form as a painkiller. Is it difficult to imagine just what would have happened had their plan succeeded? All those hundreds of thousands of soldiers would have left the battlefields totally hooked on opium. The Beatles were much more successful in turning out millions of teenage addicts in later years. They were all given OBEs by Queen Elizabeth II, and Paul McCartney was even given a knighthood. The Bengal merchants and their British controllers and bankers grew fat and intolerant on the enormous amounts of money that poured into the coffers of the British East India Company from the wretched Chinese coolies' opium trade. Peak profits, even in those years, far exceeded the combined profits made in a single year by General Motors, Ford and Chrysler in their heydays. The trend in making huge profits out of drugs was carried over into the 1960s by such legal drug death merchants as Sandoz, the makers of LSD, and Hoffmann-La Roche, manufacturers of Valium. The cost of the raw material and manufacturing of Valium to Hoffmann-La Roche is $3 per kilo. 2.2 pounds. It is sold to their distributors for $20,000 per kilo. By the time it reaches the consumer, the price of Valium has risen to $50,000 per kilo. Valium is used in huge quantities in Europe and the United States. It is possibly the most used, addictive, drug of its kind in the world. Hoffmann-La Roche does the same thing with vitamin C, which costs them less than 1 cent a kilo to produce. It is sold for a profit of 10,000%. When a friend of mine blew the whistle on this criminal company, which had entered into a monopoly agreement with other producers, In contravention of European Economic Community laws, he was arrested on the Swiss-Italian border and hustled into prison. His wife was threatened by the Swiss police until she committed suicide. As a British national, he was rescued by the British consul in Bern as soon as word of his plight was received, removed from prison and flown out of the country. He lost his wife, his job and his pension because he dared to disclose Hoffmann La Roche's secrets. The Swiss take their industrial espionage law very seriously. Remember this the next time you see those lovely advertisements of Swiss ski slopes, beautiful watches, pristine mountains and cuckoo clocks. That is not what Switzerland is about. It is about dirty multi-billion-dollar money laundering which is carried out by major Swiss banking houses. It is about the Committee of 300 legal, addictive, drug manufacturers. Switzerland is the committee's ultimate safe haven for money and protection of their bodies in time of global calamity. Now mind you, one could get into serious trouble with the Swiss authorities for giving out any information on these nefarious activities. The Swiss regard it as industrial espionage, which usually carries a 5-year term in prison. It is safer to pretend that Switzerland is a nice clean country rather than look under the covers or inside its garbage can banks. In 1931, the managing directors of the so-called Big Five British companies were rewarded by being made peers of the realm for their activities in drug money laundering. Who decided such matters and bestows such honours? It is the Queen of England who bestows honours upon the men in the top positions in the drug trade. British banks engaged in this terrible trade are too numerous to mention, but a few of the top ones are, the British Bank of the Middle East, Midland Bank, National and Westminster Bank, Barclays Bank, Royal Bank of Canada, Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, HSBC, Baring Brothers Bank. Many of the merchant banks are up to their hocks in pig swill drug trade profits. Banks such as Hambro's, for example, run by Sir Jocelyn Hambro. For a really interesting major study of the Chinese opium trade, one would need access to India office in London. I was able to get in there because of my intelligence service and received great assistance from the trustee of the papers of the late Professor Frederick Wells Williamson, which provided much information on the opium trade carried on by the British East India Company in India and China in the 18th and 19th centuries. If only those papers could be made public, what a storm would burst over the heads of the crowned vipers of Europe. Today the trade has shifted somewhat in that less expensive cocaine has taken over a good part of the North American market. In the 1960s the flood of heroin coming from Hong Kong, Lebanon and Dubai threatened to engulf the United States and Western Europe. When demand outpaced supply there was a switch to cocaine. But now, at the end of 1991, that trend has been reversed. Today it is heroin that is back in favor. Although it is true that cocaine still enjoys great favor among the poorer classes. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers. Ye, serpents, ye, generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hellfire? Christ, Matthew 23:32-33. Heroin, we are told, is more satisfying to addicts. The effects are far more intense and last longer than the effects of cocaine, and there is less international attention on heroin producers than there is on Colombian cocaine shippers. Besides which, it is hardly likely that the US would make any real effort to stop the production of opium in the Golden Triangle, which is under the control of the Chinese military. A serious war would erupt if any country tried to interdict the trade. A serious attack on the opium trade would bring Chinese military intervention. The British know this. They have no quarrel with China, except for an occasional squabble over who gets the larger share of the pie. Britain has been involved in the China opium trade for over 2 centuries. No one is going to be so foolish as to rock the boat when millions upon millions of dollars flow into the bank accounts of the British oligarchists and more gold is traded on the Hong Kong gold market than the combined total traded in London and New York. On the 21st of October 1999 the Chinese president was given the red carpet treatment by Buckingham Palace and he was transported in style, with the Queen, in her gilded royal horse-drawn coach and Rolls-Royce limousine, with very lavish arrangements made to impress and entertain him. Whilst at the same time the British police forcefully restrained anyone from demonstrating against China's human rights record, so as not to upset him. Those individuals who fondly imagine they can do some kind of a deal with a minor Chinese or Burmese overlord in the hills of the Golden Triangle apparently have no idea of what is involved. If they had known, they would never have talked about stopping the opium trade. Such talk reveals little knowledge of the immensity and complexity of China's opium trade. British plutocrats, the Russian KGB, the CIA, and US bankers are all in league with China. Could one man stop or even make a small dent in the trade? It would be absurd to imagine it. What is heroin and why is it favored over cocaine these days? According to the noted authority on the subject Professor Galen, heroin is a derivative of opium, a drug that stupefies the senses and induces long periods of sleep. This is what most addicts like. It is called being in the arms of Morpheus. Opium is the most habit-forming drug known to man. Many pharmaceutical drugs contain opium in various degrees, and it is believed that paper used in the manufacture of cigarettes is first impregnated with opium, which is why smokers become so addicted to their habit. The poppy seed from which it is derived was long known to the Mughals of India, who used the seeds mixed in tea offered to a difficult opponent. It is also used as a pain-killing drug which largely replaced chloroform and other older anesthetics of a bygone era. Opium was popular in all of the fashionable clubs of Victorian London, and it was no secret that men like the Huxley brothers used it extensively. Members of the Orphic Dionysus cults of Hellenic Greece and the Osiris-Horus cults of Ptolemaic Egypt, which Victorian society embraced, all smoked opium. It was the in thing to do. So did some of those who met at Street Termines Hotel in 1903 to decide what sort of a world we would have. The descendants of the Street Termines crowd are found today in the Committee of 300. It is these so-called world leaders who brought about such a change in our environment that enabled drug usage to proliferate to the point where it can no longer be stopped by regular law enforcement tactics and policies. This is especially true in big cities where big populations can conceal a great deal of what transpires. Many in the circles of royalty were regular opium users. One of their favorites was the writer Coudenhove Calighi, who wrote a book in 1932 entitled Revolution Through Technology, which was a blueprint for the return of the world to a medieval society. The book, in fact, became a working paper for the Committee of 300's plan to de-industrialize the world, starting with the United States. Claiming that pressures of overpopulation are a serious problem, Calighi advised a return to what he called open spaces. Does this sound like the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot? Here are some extracts from the book. In its facilities, the city of the future will resemble the city of the Middle Ages. And he who is not condemned to live in a city because of his occupation, will go to the countryside. Our civilization is a culture of the major cities, therefore it is a marsh plant, born by degenerated, sickly and decadent people, who have voluntarily, or involuntarily, ended up in this dead-end street of life. Isn't that very close to what Angkor Wat gave us his reasons for depopulating Phnom Penh? The first opium shipments reached England from Bengal in 1683, carried in British East India Company tea clippers. Opium was brought to England as a test, an experiment, to see whether the common folk of England, the yeomen and the lower classes, could be induced into taking the drug. It was what we would call today test marketing of a new product. But the sturdy yeomen and the much derided lower classes were made of stern stuff, and the test marketing experiment was a total flop. The lower classes of British society firmly rejected opium smoking. The plutocrats and oligarchists in high society in London began casting about for a market that would not be so resistant, so unbending. They found such a market in China. In the papers I studied at the India office under the heading Miscellaneous Old Records, I found all the confirmation I could have wished for in proving that the opium trade in China really took off following the founding of the British East India Company-funded China Inland Mission, ostensibly a Christian missionary society, but in reality the promotion men and women for the new product being introduced into the market, the new product being opium. This was later confirmed when I was given access to the papers of Sir George Birdwood in India Office Records. Soon after, the China Inland Mission missionaries set out to give away their sample packages and show the coolies how to smoke opium. Vast quantities of opium began to arrive in China. The Beatles could not have done a better job. In both cases the trade was sanctioned by the British royal family, who openly supported the Beatles. Where the British East India Company had failed in England, it now succeeded beyond its wildest expectations in China, whose teeming millions of poor looked upon smoking opium as an escape from their life of misery. Opium dens began proliferating all across China, and in the big cities like Shanghai and Canton, hundreds of thousands of miserable Chinese found that a pipe of opium seemingly made life bearable. The British East India Company had a clear run for over 100 years before the Chinese government woke up to what was happening. It was only in 1729 that the first laws against opium smoking were passed. The 300 board members of Beak did not like it one bit and, never one to back down. The company was soon engaged in a running battle with the Chinese government. The Beak had developed poppy seeds that brought the finest quality opium from the poppy fields of Benares and Bihar in the Ganges Basin in India, a country they fully controlled. This fetched top price, while the lower grades of opium from other areas of India were sold for less. Not about to lose their lucrative market, the British Crown engaged in running battles with Chinese forces, and defeated them. In the same manner, the U.S. government is supposedly fighting a running battle against today's drug barons and, like the Chinese, are losing heavily. There is however one big difference: the Chinese government fought to win, whereas the United States government is under no compunction to win the battle, which explains why staff turnover in the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, is so high. Ever wondered why these people are referred to as drug barons, rather than drug kings? If these people are only barons, who are the drug kings? Latterly, high-grade quality opium has come out of Pakistan via Ankara on the desolate coastline of the country, from whence ships take the cargo to Dubai, where it is exchanged for gold. This is said to account in part for heroin being favored over cocaine today. The heroin trade is more discreet. There is no murder of prominent officials such as became an almost daily occurrence in Colombia. Pakistani opium does not sell for as much as Golden Triangle or Golden Crescent, Iranian opium. This has greatly spurred heroin production and sales, which threaten to overtake cocaine as the #1 seller. The vile opium trade was talked about in the upper crust circles of English society for many years as the spoils of the empire. The tall tales of valor in the Khyber Pass covered a vast trade in opium. The British Army was stationed in the Khyber Pass to protect caravans carrying raw opium from being pillaged by hill tribesmen. Did the British royal family know this? They must have. What else would induce the Crown to keep an army in this region where there was nothing of much worth other than the lucrative opium trade? It was very expensive to keep men under arms in a faraway country. Her Majesty must have asked why these military units were there. Certainly not to play polo or billiards in the officers' mess. The Beak was jealous of its monopoly in opium. Would-be competitors received short shrift. In a noted trial in 1791, a certain Warren Hastings was put on charges that he helped a friend to get into the opium trade at the expense of the Beak. The actual wording which I found in the records of the case housed in India Office gives some insight into the vast opium trade. The charge is that Hastings has granted a contract for the provision of opium for 4 years to Stephen Sullivan, without advertising for the same, on terms glaringly obvious and wantonly profuse, for the purpose of creating an instant fortune for the said William Sullivan Esquire. Emphasis added, as the Beak British government held the monopoly in opium trading, the only people allowed to make instant fortunes were the nobility, the aristocracy, the plutocrats and oligarchical families of England, many of whose descendants sit on the Committee of 300 just as their forebears sat on the Council of 300 who ran the Beak. Outsiders like Mr. Sullivan soon found themselves in trouble with the Crown if they were so bold as to try and help themselves get into the multi-billion-pound sterling opium business. The honourable men of the Beak with its list of 300 councillors were members of all the famous gentlemen's clubs in London, and they were, for the most part, members of Parliament, while others, both in India and at home, were magistrates. Company passports were required to land in China. When a few busybodies arrived in China to investigate the British Crown's involvement in the lucrative trade, Beak magistrates promptly revoked their passports, thus effectively denying them entry into China. Friction with the Chinese government was common. The Chinese had passed a law, the Yongchen Edict of 1729, forbidding the importation of opium. Yet the Beak managed to keep opium as an entry in the Chinese customs tariff books until 1753, the duty being 3 taels per chest of opium. Even when British Special Secret Service, the 007 of the day, saw to it that troublesome Chinese officials were bought off, and in cases where that was not possible, they were simply murdered. Every British monarch since 1729 has benefited immensely from the drug trade, and this holds good for the present occupant of the throne. Their ministers saw to it that wealth flowed into their family coffers. One such minister of Victoria's was Lord Palmerston. He clung obstinately to the belief that nothing should be allowed to stop Britain's opium trade with China. Palmerston's plan was to supply the Chinese government with enough opium to make individual members become greedy. Then the British would withhold supplies, and when the Chinese government was on its knees, supplies would be resumed, but at a much higher price, thus retaining a monopoly through the Chinese government itself. But the plan failed. The Chinese government responded by destroying large cargoes of opium stored in warehouses, and British merchants were required to sign individual agreements not to import any more opium into Canton. Beak responded by sending scores of fully loaded opium-carrying ships to lie in the roads of Macau. Companies beholden to Beak, rather than individuals, then sold these cargoes. Chinese Commissioner Lin said, "There is so much opium on board English vessels now lying in the roads of this place, Macau, which will never be returned to the country from which it came, and I shall not be surprised to hear of its being smuggled in under American colors." Lin's prophecy proved to be remarkably accurate. The opium wars against China were designed to put the Chinese in their place, as Lord Palmerston once said, and the British Army did that. There was simply no stopping the vast, lucrative trade which provided the British oligarchical feudal lords with untold billions, while leaving China with millions of opium addicts. In later years the Chinese appealed to Britain for help with their immense problem and received it. Thereafter respective Chinese governments realized the value in cooperating instead of fighting with Britain, and this held good during the bloody rule of Mao Zedong, so that today, as I have already mentioned, any quarrels that come about are only over the share of the opium trade each is entitled to. To advance to more modern history, the Chinese-British partnership was solidified by the Hong Kong Agreement, which established an equal partnership in the opium trade. This has proceeded smoothly, with an occasional ripple here and there, but while violence and death, robbery and murder marked the progression of the Colombian cocaine trade, no such baseness was allowed to disturb the heroin trade, which, as I said earlier, is once again coming into the ascendancy as we near the end of 1991. The major problem that arose in Sino-British relations during the past 60 years concerned China's demand for a larger slice of the opium heroin pie. This was settled when Britain agreed to hand Hong Kong over to full Chinese government control, which will come into effect in 1997. Other than that, the partners retain their former equal shares of the lucrative opium trade based in Hong Kong. The British oligarchical families of the Committee of 300 who were entrenched in Canton at the height of the opium trade left their descendants in position. Look at a list of prominent British residents in China and you will see the names of members of the Committee of 300 among them. The same holds good for Hong Kong. These plutocrats of a feudal era, that they seek to return to the world, control the gold and opium trade of which Hong Kong is the center. Burmese and Chinese opium poppy growers get paid in gold. They do not trust the US paper $100 bill. This explains the very large volume of gold trade in the Hong Kong exchange. The Golden Triangle is no longer the largest producer of opium. That dubious title has, since 1987, been shared by the Golden Crescent, Iran, Pakistan and Lebanon. These are the principal opium producers, although smaller quantities are once again coming out of Afghanistan and Turkey. The drug trade, and more especially the opium trade, could not function without the help of banks, as we shall demonstrate as we proceed. Banks and drugs. How do banks with their great air of respectability fit into the drug trade with all of its attendant filth? It is a very long and complicated story, which could be the subject of a book on its own. One way in which banks participate is by financing front companies importing the chemicals needed to process raw opium into heroin. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank with a branch office in London is right in the middle of such trade through a company called Peccei, which banks with Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. What does this company do? It imports into Hong Kong most of the chemicals needed in the heroin refining process. It is also a major supplier of acetic anhydride for the Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle, Pakistan, Turkey and Lebanon. The actual financing for this trading is hived off to the Bangkok Metropolitan Bank. Thus, the secondary activities connected with processing opium, while not in the same category as the opium trade, nevertheless generates substantial income for banks. But the real income of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank and indeed all banks in the region is financing the actual opium trade. It took a lot of research on my part to link the price of gold to the price of opium. I used to tell anyone who would listen, if you want to know the price of gold, find out what the price of a pound or a kilo of opium is in Hong Kong. To my critics I answered, take a look at what happened in 1977, a critical year for gold. The Bank of China shocked the gold pundits, and those clever forecasters who are to be found in great numbers in America, by suddenly and without warning, dumping 80 tons of gold on the market. That depressed the price of gold in a big hurry. All the experts could say was, we never knew China had that much gold. Where could it have come from? It came from the gold which is paid to China in the Hong Kong gold market for large purchases of opium. The current policy of the Chinese government toward England is the same as it was in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Chinese economy, tied to the economy of Hong Kong, and I don't mean television sets, textiles, radios, watches, pirated cassette and videotapes, I mean opium. Heroin would take a terrible beating if it were not for the opium trade it shares with Britain. The beak is gone, but the descendants of the Council of 300 linger on in the membership of the Committee of 300. The oldest of the oligarchical British families who were leaders in the opium trade for the past 200 years are still in it today. Take the Malthusons, for instance. This noble family is one of the pillars of the opium trade. When things looked a bit shaky a few years ago, the Malthusons stepped in and gave China a loan of $300 million for real estate investment. Actually it was billed as a joint venture between the People's Republic of China and the Malthuson Bank. When researching India office papers of the 1700s I came across the name of Malthuson, and it kept on cropping up everywhere. London, Peking, Dubai, Hong Kong, wherever heroin and opium are mentioned. The problem with the drug trade is that it has become a threat to national sovereignty. Here is what the Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations said about this worldwide threat. The problem of drugs has already ceased to be dealt with simply as one of public health or a social problem. It has turned into something far more serious and far-reaching which affects our national sovereignty, a problem of national security, because it strikes at the independence of a nation. Drugs in all their manifestations of production, commercialization and consumption, denaturalizes us by injuring our ethical, religious and political life, our historic, economic, and republican values. This is precisely the way the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF are operating. Let me say without hesitation that both these banks are nothing more than bully boy clearinghouses for the drug trade. The BIS undermines any country that the IMF wants to sink by setting up ways and means for the easy outflow of flight capital. Nor does BIS recognize nor make any distinction when it comes down to what is flight capital and what is laundered drug money. The BIS operates on gangster lines. If a country will not submit to asset stripping by the IMF, then it says in effect, right, then we will break you by means of the huge cache of narco dollars we are holding. It is easy to understand why gold was demonetized and substituted with the paper dollar as the world's reserve currency. It is not as easy to blackmail a country holding gold reserves as it is one having its reserves in paper dollars. The IMF held a meeting in Hong Kong a few years ago which was attended by a colleague of mine, and he told me the seminar dealt with this very question. He informed me that the IMF agents told the meeting that they could literally cause a run on any country's currency, using narco dollars, which would precipitate a flight of capital. Rainer Gut, a Credit Suisse delegate and member of the Committee of 300, said he foresaw a situation where national credit and national financing would be under one umbrella organization by the turn of the century. While Rainer Gut did not spell it out, everybody at the seminar knew exactly what he was talking about. From Colombia to Miami, from the Golden Triangle to the Golden Gate, from Hong Kong to New York, from Bogota to Frankfurt, the drug trade, and more especially the heroin trade, is big business, and it is run from the top down by some of the most untouchable families in the world, and each of those families have at least one member who is on the Committee of 300. It is not a street corner business, and it takes a great deal of money and expertise to keep it flowing smoothly. The machinery under control of the Committee of 300 ensures this. The British royal family has set up the British courts, established their own laws and legal system in such a way that legal action cannot be taken against the monarch, by anyone. Such talents are not found on the street corners and subways of New York. To be sure, the pushers and peddlers are an integral part of the trade, but only as very small part-time salesmen. I say part-time because they are caught and rivalry gets some of them shot. But what does that matter? There are plenty of replacements available. No, it is not anything the Small Business Administration would be interested in. It is big business, a vast empire, this dirty drug business. Of necessity, it is operated from the top down in every single country in the world. It is, in fact, the largest single enterprise in the world today, transcending all others. That it is protected from the top down is borne out by the fact that, like international terrorism, it cannot be stamped out, which should indicate to a reasonable person that some of the biggest names in royal circles, the oligarchy, the plutocracy, are running it, even if it is done through intermediaries. The main countries involved in growing poppies and the coca bush are Burma, northern China, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Thailand, Lebanon, Turkey, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia. Colombia does not grow the coca bush, but, next to Bolivia, is the main refiner of cocaine and the chief financial center of the cocaine trade, which, since General Noriega was kidnapped and imprisoned by President Bush, is being challenged by Panama for first place in money laundering and capital financing of the cocaine trade. The heroin trade is financed by Hong Kong banks, London banks and some Middle East banks such as the British Bank of the Middle East. Lebanon is fast becoming the Switzerland of the Middle East. Countries involved in the distribution and routing of heroin are Hong Kong, Turkey, Bulgaria, Italy, Monaco, France, Corsica and Marseille, Lebanon and Pakistan. The United States is the largest consumer of narcotics, first place going to cocaine, which is being challenged by heroin. Western Europe and Southwest Asian countries are the biggest users of heroin. Iran has a huge heroin addict population, in excess of 2 million as of 1991. There is not a single government that does not know precisely what is going on with regard to the drug trade, but individual members holding powerful positions are taken care of by the Committee of 300 through its worldwide network of subsidiaries. If any government member is difficult, he or she is removed, as in the case of Pakistan's Ali Bhutto and Italy's Aldo Moro. No one is beyond the reach of this all-powerful committee, even though Malaysia has been successful in holding out up until now. Malaysia has the strictest anti-drug laws in the world. Possession of even small amounts is punishable by the death penalty. Like the Kintex Company of Bulgaria, most smaller countries have a direct hand in these criminal enterprises. Kintex trucks regularly ferried heroin through Western Europe in its own fleet of trucks bearing the EEC marker Triangle International RIIA. Trucks bearing this marker and the EEC recognition number are not supposed to be stopped at customs border posts. Trucks are allowed to carry only perishable items. They are supposed to be inspected in the country from whence they originated, and documentation to this effect is supposed to be carried by each truck driver. Under international treaty obligations this is what happens, thus Kintex trucks were able to load their cargoes of heroin and certify it as fresh fruit and vegetables, and then make their way through Western Europe, even entering high-security NATO bases in northern Italy. In this manner, Bulgaria became one of the principal countries through which heroin was routed. The only way to stop the huge amounts of heroin and cocaine presently finding their way to markets in Europe is to end the TIR system. That will never happen. The international treaty obligations I have just mentioned were set up by the Committee of 300, using its amazing networks and control mechanisms, to facilitate passage of all manner of drugs to Western Europe. Forget perishable goods. A former DU agent stationed in Italy told me, TIR equals dope. Remember this the next time you read in the newspapers that a big haul of heroin was found in a false bottom suitcase at Kennedy Airport, and some unlucky mule pays the price for his criminal activity. This kind of action is only small potatoes, sand in the eyes of the public, to make us think our government is really doing something about the drug menace. Take for example, the French Connection, a Nixon program embarked upon without the knowledge and consent of the Committee of 300. The entire amount of opium, heroin seized in that massive effort is somewhat less than 1/4 of what a single TIR truck carries. The Committee of 300 saw to it that Nixon paid a heavy price for a relatively small seizure of heroin. It was not the amount of heroin involved, but a matter of one whom they had helped up the ladder to the White House, believing that he could now do without their help and backing, and even go against direct orders from above. The mechanics of the heroin raid go like this: wild Thai and Burmese hill tribesmen grow the opium poppy. At harvest time, the seed-bearing pod is cut with a razor or sharp knife. A resinous substance leaks through the cut and starts to congeal. This is raw opium. The crop of raw opium is made up into sticky roundish balls. The tribesmen are paid in 1 kilo gold bars, known as 4/10 THS, which are minted by Credit Suisse. These small bars are used only to pay the tribesmen. The normal weight gold bars are traded on the Hong Kong market by the big buyers of raw opium or partly processed heroin. The same methods are used to pay hill tribesmen in India, the Balukis, who have been in this business since the days of the Mughals. The dope season, as it is called, sees a flood of gold traded on the Hong Kong market. Mexico has started producing relatively small amounts of heroin called Mexican brown, which is much in demand by the Hollywood crowd. Here again the heroin trade is run by top government officials who have the military on their side. Some producers of Mexican brown are making $1 million a month by supplying their U.S. clients. On occasions when a few Mexican federal police are prodded into taking action against the heroin producers, they are taken out by military units who seem to appear as if from nowhere. Such an incident occurred in November 1991 at an isolated airstrip in Mexico's opium-producing region. Federal narcotics agents surrounded the strip and were about to arrest people who were in the act of loading heroin when a squad of soldiers arrived. The soldiers rounded up the federal narcotics police agents and systematically killed all of them. This action posed a serious threat to Mexican President Coleman, who is faced with loud demands for a full-scale investigation into the murders. Coleman is over a barrel, he can't back off from calling for an inquiry, and neither can he afford to offend the military. It is the first such crack in the tight chain of command in Mexico, that stretches all the way back to the Committee of 300. Raw opium from the Golden Triangle is pipelined to the Sicilian Mafia and the French end of the business for refining in the laboratories that infest the French coastline from Marseille to Monte Carlo. Nowadays, Lebanon and Turkey are turning out increasing amounts of refined heroin, and a large number of laboratories have sprung up in these two countries in the past 4 years. Pakistan also has a number of laboratories, but it is not in the same league as France, for example. The route taken by the raw opium carriers of the Golden Crescent goes through Iran, Turkey and Lebanon. When the Shah of Iran was in control of the country, he refused to allow the heroin trade to continue, and it was forcibly discontinued up until the time that he was dealt with by the Committee of 300. Raw opium from Turkey and Lebanon finds its way to Corsica, from where it is shipped to Monte Carlo with the connivance of the Grimaldi family. Pakistani laboratories, under the guise of military defense laboratories, are doing a bigger share of refining than they were 2 years ago. But the best refining is still done along the French Mediterranean coastline and in Turkey. Here again, banks play a vital role in financing these operations. Let us stop here for a moment. Are we to believe that with all the modern and vastly improved surveillance techniques, including satellite reconnaissance, available to law enforcement agencies in these countries, that this vile trade cannot be pinpointed and stopped? How is it that law enforcement agencies cannot go in and destroy these laboratories once they are discovered? If this is the case, and we still cannot interdict the heroin trade, then our anti-narcotics services ought to be known as the geriatrics and not drug enforcement agencies. Even a child could tell our alleged drug watchers what to do. Simply keep a check on all factories making acetic anhydride, the most essential chemical component needed by laboratories to refine heroin from raw opium. Then follow the trail. It is as simple as that. I am reminded of Peter Sellers in the Pink Panther series when I think of law enforcement efforts to locate heroin refining laboratories. Even someone as bumbling as the imaginary inspector would have had no trouble in following the route taken by acetic anhydride shipments to their final destination. Governments could make laws that would oblige manufacturers of acetic anhydride to keep scrupulous records showing who buys the chemical and for what purposes it is to be used. But do not hold your breath on this one. Remember, dope equals big business, and big business is done by the oligarchical families of Europe and the United States' Eastern liberal establishment. The drug business is not a mafia operation, nor one run by the Colombian cocaine cartels. The noble families of Britain and America's trop people are not going to advertise their role in the shop windows. They always have a layer of front men to do the dirty work. Remember, British and American nobility never dirtied their hands in the China opium trade. The lords and ladies were much too clever for that, as were the American elite. The Delanos, Forbes, Appletons, Bacons, Boylstons, Perkins, Russells, Cunninghams, Shaws, Coolidges, Parkmans, Runnells, Cabots and Codmans, by no means a complete list of families in America who grew immensely wealthy from the China opium trade. Since this is not a book about the drug trade, I cannot, of necessity, cover the subject in an in-depth manner. But its importance to the Committee of 300 must be emphasized. America is run not by 60 families but by 300 families, and England is run by 100 families, and, as we shall see, these families are intertwined through marriage, companies, banks, not to mention ties to the black nobility, Freemasonry, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem and so on. These are the people who, through their surrogates, find ways to protect huge shipments of heroin from Hong Kong, Turkey, Iran and Pakistan, and ensure they reach the marketplaces in the US and Western Europe with the minimum cost of doing business. Shipments of cocaine are sometimes interdicted and seized as mere window dressing. Oftentimes the shipments seized belong to a new organization trying to break into the trade. Such competition is put out of business by informing the authorities exactly where it is going to enter the US and who the owners are. The big stuff is never touched. Heroin is too expensive. It is worthy of note that U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency operatives are not allowed into Hong Kong. They cannot examine any ship's manifest before it leaves the port. One wonders why, if there is so much international cooperation going on, what the media likes to characterize as smashing the dope trade. Clearly the trade routes for heroin are protected by a higher authority. In South America, apart from Mexico, cocaine is king. The production of cocaine is very simple, unlike heroin, and great fortunes are to be made by those willing to take risks for and on behalf of the higher-ups. As in the heroin trade, interlopers are not welcome and often finish up as casualties, or victims of family feuds. In Colombia the drug mafia is a closely knit family. But such has been the bad publicity generated by the M19 guerrilla attack on the Justice Building in Bogotá. M19 is the private army of the cocaine barons, and the murder of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a prominent prosecutor and a judge, that the higher authority had to rearrange matters in Colombia. Accordingly, the ACOAs of the Medellin cartel turned themselves in after being assured that they would not suffer any loss of fortune, harm of any kind, nor would they be extradited to the United States. A deal was struck that, provided they repatriated the bulk of their huge narco-dollar fortunes to Colombian banks, no punitive action would be taken against them. The ACOAs, Jorge, Fabio, and their top man, Pablo Escobar, would be held in private jails that resemble a luxury-class motel room, and then be sentenced to a maximum term of 2 years, to be served in the same motel jail. This deal is ongoing. The ACOAs have also been guaranteed the right to continue to manage their business from their motel prison. But that does not mean that the cocaine trade has come to a screeching halt. On the contrary, it has simply been transferred to the second-string Cali cartel, and it is business as usual. For some strange reason the Cali cartel, which is equal in size to the Medellin cartel, has been, at least up until now, largely ignored by the DIA. Cali differs from the Medellin cartel in that it is run by businessmen, who eschew all forms of violence and never break agreements. Even more significant is that Cali does virtually no business in Florida. My source told me that the Cali cartel is run by shrewd businessmen unlike any seen in the cocaine business. He believes that they were specially appointed, but does not know by whom. They never call attention to themselves, he said. They do not go around importing red Ferraris like Jorge Ochoa did, attracting immediate attention, because it is forbidden to import such cars into Colombia. Cali cartel markets are in Los Angeles, New York and Houston, which closely parallel the heroin markets. Cali has not shown any signs of moving into Florida. A former DIA operative who is a colleague of mine said recently, "These Cali people are sure smart. They are a different breed to the Ochoa brothers. They act like professional businessmen. They are now larger than the Medellin cartel, and I think we are going to see a lot more cocaine get into the United States than ever before." The kidnapping of Manuel Noriega will facilitate an easier flow through Panama of cocaine and money, what with so many banks there. So much for President George Bush's Operation Just Cause. All it did was make life a great deal easier for Nicolas Ardito Barletta, who used to be run by the Ochoa brothers and who is fixing to front for the Cali cartel. Based on my experience with the heroin trade, I believe that the Committee of 300 has stepped in and taken over full control of the South American cocaine trade. There is no other explanation for the rise of the Cali cartel, which is coupled with the kidnapping of Noriega. Did Bush take his orders from London regarding Noriega? There is every indication that he was literally pushed into invading Panama and kidnapping Noriega, who had become a serious impediment to trade in Panama, especially in the banking business. Several former intelligence agents have given me their opinions, which coincide with my own. Like the Gulf War that followed in the wake of Panama, it was only after several calls from the British ambassador in Washington that Bush finally plucked up enough courage to make his totally illegal move on General Noriega. That he was supported by the British press and the New York Times, a British intelligence-run newspaper, speaks volumes. Noriega was formerly the darling of the Washington establishment. He frequently hobnobbed with William Casey and Oliver North and even met with President George Bush on at least 2 occasions. Noriega was often seen at the Pentagon, where he was treated like one of those Arab potentates, and the red carpet was always laid out for him at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. U.S. Army intelligence and the CIA are on record as having paid him $320,000. Then storm clouds began to appear on the horizon at about the same time the Cali cartel was taking over the cocaine trade from the Ochoa brothers and Pablo Escobar. Led by Senator Jesse Helms, who sold out to Ariel Sharon and the Israeli Histadrut Party in 1985, there suddenly began an agitation for the removal of Noriega. Jesse Helms and those of a like mind were backed up by Simon Hirsch, a British intelligence agent working for the New York Times, which has been a British intelligence mouthpiece in the US since the time that MI6 boss, Sir William Stevenson, occupied the RCA building in New York. It is very significant that Helms should have chosen to lead the charge against Noriega. Helms is the darling of the Sharon faction in Washington, and Sharon was the principal gun runner in Central America and Colombia. Moreover, Helms has the respect of the Christian fundamentalists who believe in the maxim, Israel, my country, right or wrong. Thus a powerful momentum was created to get Noriega. It is evident that Noriega could well prove a serious impediment to the international drug merchants and the Committee of 300 bankers, so he had to be removed before he could do some significant damage. Bush was pressured by his British masters to conduct an illegal search and seizure operation in Panama that resulted in the deaths of no less than 7,000 Panamanians and wanton destruction of property. Nothing to implicate Noriega as a drug dealer was ever found, so he was kidnapped and brought to the US in one of the most blatant examples of international brigandry in history. This illegal action probably best meets the Bush philosophy. The moral dimensions of American, read British royal family. The Committee of 300, foreign policy require us to chart a moral course through a world of lesser evils. That's the real world, not black and white. Very few absolutes. It was a lesser evil to kidnap Noriega, rather than have him upend the banks in Panama, that are, working for the Committee of 300. The Noriega case is a prototype of monstrous one-world government actions waiting in the wings. An emboldened Bush came right out in the open, unafraid, because we, the people, have put on a spiritual mantle that accommodates lies and wants no part of truth. This is the world we have decided to accept. If it were not so, a firestorm of anger would have swept the country over the invasion of Panama, which would not have stopped until Bush was hounded from office. Nixon's Watergate transgressions pale into insignificance next to the many impeachable offenses committed by President Bush when he ordered the invasion of Panama to kidnap General Noriega. Isaiah 30 hours 10 minutes, which say to the seers, see not, and to the prophets, prophesy not unto us right things, speak unto us smooth things, prophesy deceits, lies. The government case against Noriega is based upon perjured testimony by a group of big men, for the most part, already convicted and lying through their individual and collective teeth to get their own sentences lightened. Their performance would have pleased Gilbert and Sullivan immensely, were they alive today. They made them the rulers of Deer, might be apropos instead of, they made them the rulers of Queen's Navy, from HMS Pinafore. It is an altogether grotesque scene to see how these con artists are performing like not so well-trained SEALs for the U.S. Justice Department, that is, if we care to insult such a nice clean animal by such an unworthy comparison. Key dates conflict wildly, key details are altogether conspicuous by their absence, lapses of memory on crucial points all add up to the obvious fact that the government has no case against Noriega, but that does not matter. The Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIIA, says convict him anyway, and that is what poor Noriega can expect. One of the Justice Department's star witnesses is one Floyd Carlton Cassiers, a former pilot for the Ochoa brothers. Following his arrest in 1986, Carlton tried to ease his position at the expense of Noriega. He told his DU interrogators that the Ochoa brothers had paid Noriega $600,000 to allow 3 planes loaded with cocaine to land and refuel in Panama. But once in court in Miami, it soon became apparent that what was billed as the star witness for the prosecution was, at best, a damp squib. Under cross-examination the true story emerged. Far from being paid to allow the flights, Noriega wasn't even approached by the Ochoas. Worse yet, in December of 1983, Noriega had ordered that all flights to Panama from Medellin be refused permission to land in Panama. Carlton is not the only discredited witness. One who is even a sorrier liar than Carlton is Carlos Leda, who was a kingpin in the Medellin cartel until he was arrested in Spain and sent to the US, who gave the DIA the most vital information that Leda was in Madrid. The DIA reluctantly concedes that they owe this important catch to Noriega. Now, however, the Justice Department is using Leda as a witness against Noriega. If nothing else, this single witness demonstrates the wretchedness of the United States government's case against Manuel Noriega. In return for services rendered, Leda has been granted an easing of his sentence and far nicer quarters, a room with a view and television, and his family was given permanent residence in the U.S. Robert Merkel, a former U.S. attorney who prosecuted Leda in 1988, told the Washington Post, "I don't think the government should be in the business of dealing with Carlos Leda, period. This guy is a liar from beginning to end." The Justice Department, purely a name which bears no resemblance to what it is supposed to stand for, has pulled out all its dirty tricks against Noriega, illegally wiretapping his conversations with his lawyer, appointing a government lawyer to pretend he was serving Noriega but who quit in the middle of everything, freezing his bank accounts so that Noriega is unable to conduct a proper defense, kidnapping, illegal search and seizure. You name it, the government has broken more laws than Noriega has ever done, if indeed he has broken any laws at all. It is the U.S. Justice Department that is on trial tenfold more than General Noriega. The Noriega case shows the glaringly evil system that passes for justice in this country. The U.S. war on drugs is on trial, as is the Bush administration's so-called drug policy. The Noriega trial, although it will end in a violent and flagrant rape of justice, will nevertheless offer some compensation to those who are not blind, deaf and dumb. It proves for once and for all that Britain is in charge of our government, and it will reveal the utterly bankrupt ideology of the Bush administration, which ought to have as its motto, "No matter what, the end always justifies the means." There are very few moral absolutes. Like the majority of politicians, for Bush to have a standard of absolute morality would be suicidal. Only in this climate could we have allowed President Bush to violate at least 6 United States laws and dozens of international agreements in going to war against Iraq. What we are witnessing in Colombia and Washington is a complete revision of how the cocaine trade is to be run. No more wild stuff, no more blazing guns. Let the gentlemen of the Cali cartel in pinstripe suits conduct the business in a gentlemanly way. In short, the Committee of 300 has taken a direct hand in the cocaine trade, which henceforth will go as smoothly as the heroin trade. The new government of Colombia is geared to the change in tactics and direction. It is on notice to perform according to the committee's game plan. There is need to mention U.S. participation in the China opium trade, which began in the southern United States prior to the war between the states. How can we tie the opium trade in with the great cotton plantations of the South? To do that, we have to start in Bengal, India, producers of the finest, if one can call such a foul substance fine, opium, which was much in demand. Cotton was the biggest trade in England, after opium sales through the beak. Most of the cotton from southern plantations was worked in the slave mills of northern England, where women and children earned a pittance for a 16-hour day's work. The cloth mills were owned by the wealthy socialites in London, the Barings, Palmerstons, Keswicks and most of all the Jardine Mathesons, who owned the Blue Star shipping line, on which the finished cotton cloth goods were shipped to India. They could not care less about the hapless conditions endured by Her Majesty's subjects. After all, that is what they were for, and their husbands and sons were useful for fighting wars to preserve Her Majesty's far-flung empire, as they had done for centuries, and latterly, in the bloody Boer War. That was British tradition, wasn't it? Cotton cloth finished goods exported to India undercut and destroyed the long-standing Indian producers of the cotton finished goods trade. Terrible privation was endured by thousands of Indians thrown out of work as a result of cheaper British goods taking over their markets. India then became utterly dependent upon Britain to earn enough currency to pay for its railroads and finished cotton goods imports. There was only one solution to India's economic woes. Produce more opium and sell it for less to the British East India Company. This was the rock upon which British trade grew and flourished. Without its opium trade, Britain would have been as bankrupt. Did the southern plantation owners know about the ugly secret of opium for cotton goods? It is unlikely that some of them didn't know what was going on. Take, for instance, the Sutherland family, one of the largest cotton plantation owners in the South. The Sutherlands were closely related to the Matheson family, Jardine Matheson, who in turn had as their business partners the Baring brothers, founders of the famous Peninsular and Orient Navigation Line, P&O, the largest of Britain's many merchant shipping lines. The Barings were big investors in southern plantations as they were in the U.S. clipper ships which plowed through the seas between Chinese ports and all the important ports along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Today the Barings run a number of very substantial financial operations in the United States. All of those names mentioned were, and their descendants still are, members of the Committee of 300. The majority of families who go to make up the Eastern liberal establishment, among whom are the wealthiest to be found in this country, derived their fortunes from either the cotton trade or the opium trade and in some instances from both. Of these the Leymans are an outstanding example. When it comes to fortunes made solely from the China opium trade, the first names that come to mind are the Astors and the Delanos. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's wife was a Delano. John Jacob Astor made a huge fortune out of the China opium trade, and then he went respectable by buying up large tracts of Manhattan real estate with his dirty money. During his lifetime Astor played a big role in the Committee of 300's deliberations. In fact, it was the Committee of 300 who chose who would be allowed to participate in the fabulously lucrative China opium trade, through its monopolist beak, and the beneficiaries of their largesse remain forever wedded to the Committee of 300. That is why, as we shall discover, most real estate in Manhattan belongs to various committee members, even as it has since the days when Astor began buying it up. With the benefit of access to records that would be closed to others outside of British intelligence, I discovered that Astor had long been an asset of British intelligence in the United States. Astor's financing of Aaron Burr, the murderer of Alexander Hamilton, proves the point beyond any reasonable doubt. John Jacob Astor's son, Waldorf Astor, had the additional honor bestowed upon him of being appointed to the Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIIA, through which organization the Committee of 300 controls every facet of our lives in the United States. The Astor family is believed to have selected Owen Lattimore to carry on their association with the opium trade, which he did through the Laura Spelman-funded Institute for Pacific Relations, IPR. It was the IPR that oversaw China's entry into the opium trade as an equal partner and not merely as a supplier. It was IPR that paved the way for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Attempts to turn the Japanese into opium addicts met with dismal failure. By the turn of the century the oligarchical plutocrats of Britain were like overgorged vultures on the Serengeti plain at the time of the annual wildebeest march. Their income from the China opium trade exceeded David Rockefeller's income by several $1 billion per annum. Historic records made available to me in the British Museum in London and from India Office and other sources, former colleagues in well-placed positions, proves this completely. By 1905, the Chinese government, deeply concerned about the rise in the number of opium addicts in China, tried to get help from the international community. Britain pretended to cooperate, but made no move whatsoever to abide by the 1905 protocols it had signed. Later Her Majesty's government did an about-face after showing China that it was better to join them in the opium business rather than to try and end it. Even the Hague Convention was scoffed at by the British. Delegates to the convention had agreed that Britain must abide by the protocols it had signed, which was to drastically reduce the amount of opium sold in China and elsewhere. The British, while paying lip service, had no intention of giving up their trade in human misery, which included the so-called pig trade. Their servant, President George Bush, in prosecution of the cruel war of genocide waged against the Iraqi nation solely for and on behalf of British interests, likewise showed his contempt by flouting the Hague Agreement on aerial bombardment, and a whole slew of international conventions to which the U.S. is a signatory, including all of the Geneva Conventions. When evidence was produced 2 years later, notably by the Japanese, who were growing very concerned about British smuggling of opium into their country, that opium sales had increased instead of decreased, then Her Majesty's delegate to the Fifth Hague Convention produced a set of statistics which were at variance with those provided by Japan. The British delegate turned the tables by saying that it made a very strong case for legalizing the sale of opium, which would have the effect of doing away with what he called the black market. He suggested on behalf of Her Majesty's government that the Japanese government would then have a monopoly and full control of the trade. This is precisely the same argument being advanced by the front men for the Bronfmans and other big-time dope dealers: legalize cocaine, marijuana and heroin, let the U.S. government have the monopoly and thereby stop wasting billions on the phony war on drugs and save the taxpayers billions of dollars. In the period of 1791 to 1894, the number of licensed opium dens in the Shanghai International Settlement rose from 87 to 663. Opium flowing into the United States was also stepped up. Sensing that they might have some problems in China with the spotlight of world concern shining upon them, the plutocrats of the Knights of St. John and the Order of the Garter transferred some of their attention to Persia, Iran. Lord Inchcape, who founded the biggest steamship company in the world at the turn of the 19th century, the legendary Peninsular and Orient Steam Navigation Company, was the principal mover and shaker in establishing the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which remains the largest and least controlled clearinghouse bank for the opium trade, which also financed the pig trade with the United States. The British had set up a scam whereby Chinese coolies were sent to the U.S. as so-called indentured laborers. The rapacious Harriman family's railroad needed coolies to push the rail connection westward to the California coast, or so they said. Strangely enough, very few Negroes were given the manual labor jobs they were used to at that time and could have done a better job than the emaciated opium addicts who arrived from China. The problem was that there was no market for opium among the Negroes and, moreover, Lord Inchcape, son of the founder of P&O, needed the coolies to smuggle in thousands of pounds of raw opium into North America, something the Negroes could not do. It was the same Lord Inchcape who in 1923 warned that there must be no diminishing of opium poppy cultivation in Bengal. This most important source of revenue must be safeguarded, he told the commission allegedly investigating the production of opium gum in India. By 1846, some 120,000 coolies had already arrived in the U.S. to work on Harriman's railroad, pushing westward. The pig trade was in full profitable swing because, of this number, it was estimated by the U.S. government 115,000 were opium addicts. Once the railroad was finished, the Chinese did not go back to where they came from, but settled in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Vancouver and Portland. They created a huge culture problem that has never ceased to exist. It is interesting to note that Cecil John Rhodes, the committee of 300 member who fronted for the Rothschilds in South Africa, followed the Inchcape pattern, bringing hundreds of thousands of Indian coolies to work on the sugarcane plantations in Natal province. Among them was Mahatma Gandhi, a communist agitator and troublemaker. Like the Chinese coolies, they were not returned to their country of origin once their contracts expired. They, too, went on to create a massive social program, and their descendants became lawyers who spearheaded the drive to infiltrate the government on behalf of the African National Congress. By 1875 the Chinese coolies operating out of San Francisco had set up an opium supply ring that resulted in 129,000 American opium addicts. What with the known 115,000 Chinese addicts, Lord Incape and his family were raking in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year from this source alone, which, in terms of today's dollar, would represent at least a $100 million income every year. The very same British and American families who had combined to wreck the Indian textile industry in the promotion of the opium trade, and who brought African slaves to the U.S. combined to make the pig trade a valuable source of revenue. Later they were to combine to cause and promote the terrible war between the states, also known as the American Civil War. The decadent American families of the unholy partnership, thoroughly corrupted and wallowing in filthy lucre, went on to become what we know today as the Eastern liberal establishment, whose members, under the careful guidance and direction of the Crown and subsequently its foreign policy executive arm, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA, ran this country, and still does, from top to bottom through their secret upper-level, parallel government, which is tightly meshed with the Committee of 300, the ultimate secret society. By 1923, voices were being raised against this menace that had been allowed to be imported into the United States. Believing the United States to be a free and sovereign nation, Congressman Stephen Porter, chairman of the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee, introduced a bill which called for the British to account for their opium export-import business on a country-by-country basis. The resolution set up quotas for each country, which if observed, would have reduced the opium trade by 0%. The resolution was passed into law and the bill accepted by the Congress of the United States. 1 Peter 5:1 The elders, of the 12, which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a sharer of the glory that shall be revealed. 5:2 Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. But the Royal Institute of International Affairs had other ideas. Founded in 1919 in the wake of the Paris Peace Conference held at Versailles, this was one of the earliest foreign policy executors of the Committee of 300. Research I have done on the Congressional Records House show that Porter was totally unaware of the powerful forces he was up against. Porter was not even aware of the existence of the RIIA, much less that its specific purpose was to control every facet of the United States. Apparently Congressman Porter received some kind of an intimation from the Morgan Bank on Wall Street that he should drop the whole affair. Instead, an enraged Porter took his case to the League of Nations Opium Committee. Porter's total unawareness of who he was up against is demonstrated in some of his correspondence to colleagues on the House Foreign Affairs Committee in response to open British opposition to his proposals. Her Majesty's representative chided Porter and then, acting like a father toward an errant son, the British delegate, on instructions from the RIIA, presented Her Majesty's proposals to increase opium quotas to account for an increase in the consumption of opium for medicinal purposes. According to documents that I was able to find in The Hague, Porter was at first confused, then amazed and then enraged. Joined by the Chinese delegate, Porter stormed out of the plenipotentiary session of the committee session, leaving the field to the British. In his absence, the British delegate got the League to rubber stamp Her Majesty's government proposals for a creation of a tame tiger Central Narcotics Board, whose chief function was information gathering, the terms of which were purposely vague. What was to be done with the information was never made clear. Porter returned to the US a shaken and much wiser man. Another British intelligence asset was the fabulously rich William Bingham, into which family one of the Barings married. It was stated in papers and documents that I saw, that the Baring brothers ran the Philadelphia Quakers and owned half of the real estate of that city, all made possible because of the fortune the Baring brothers had amassed from the China opium trade. Another beneficiary of the Committee of 300's largesse was Stephen Girard, whose descendants inherited the Girard Bank and Trust. The names of the families, whose history is intertwined with that of Boston and who would never give us ordinary folk the time of day, were wrapped in the arms of the Committee of 300 and its vastly lucrative Beak China opium trade. Many of the famous families became associated with the notorious Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which is still the clearinghouse for billions of dollars that flow from the opium trade in China. Such famous names as Forbes, Perkins and Hathaway appear in the records of the British East India Company. These genuine American blue bloods created Russell and Company, whose main trade was in opium, but also ran other shipping enterprises from China to South America and all points in between. As a reward for their services to the British Crown and the Beak, the Committee of 300 granted them a monopoly in the slave trade in 1833. Boston owes its celebrated past to the cotton opium slave trade granted to it by the Committee of 300, and it is stated in the records I was privileged to see in London that Boston's merchant families were the chief supporters of the British Crown in the United States. John Murray Forbes is mentioned as the major domo of the Boston Blue Bloods in India House records and in bank records in Hong Kong. Forbes' son was the first American allowed by the Committee of 300 to sit on the board of the most prestigious drug bank in the world, even today, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. When I was in Hong Kong in the early 1960s as an historian interested in the British East India Company, I was shown some old records, including past board members of this notorious drug bank, and sure enough, Forbes' name was among them. The Perkins family, so illustrious that their name is still mentioned in awed whispers, were deeply involved in the nefarious filthy China opium trade. In fact, Perkins the Elder was one of the first Americans to be elected to the Committee of 300. His son, Thomas Nelson, was Morgan's man in Boston, and as such also an agent for British intelligence. His unsavory, I would say disgusting, past was not in question when he richly endowed Harvard University. After all, Canton and Shenson are a long way from Boston, and who would have cared anyway? What helped the Perkinses a lot was that Morgan was a powerful member of the Committee of 300, which enabled Thomas N. Perkins to rapidly further his career in the China opium trade. All the Morgans and Perkinses were Freemasons, which was another tie that bound them together, for only Freemasons of highest rank have any hope of being selected by the Committee of 300. Sir Robert Hart, who for almost 3 decades was chief of the Imperial Chinese Customs Service and the British Crown's #1 agent in the opium trade in China, was subsequently appointed to the board of Morgan Guarantee Bank's Far Eastern Division. Through access to the historical records in London and Hong Kong, I was able to establish that Sir Robert developed an intimate relationship with Morgan operations in the United States. It is worthy of note that Morgan interests in the opium, heroin trade have continued in an unbroken line, witness the fact that David Newbing is on the advisory board of Morgan's Hong Kong operation, run in conjunction with Jardine Matheson. To those who know Hong Kong, the name of Newbing will be familiar as the most powerful name in Hong Kong. In addition to his membership of Morgan's elite bank, Newbing doubles as an advisor to the Chinese government. Opium for missile technology, opium for gold, opium for high-tech computers, it is all the same to Newbing. The way these banks, financial houses, trading companies and the families who run them are intertwined would perplex Sherlock Holmes, yet somehow they must be unraveled and followed, if we are to understand their connections with the drug trade and their membership in the Committee of 300. The 2-track entry into the United States of alcohol and drugs were products of the same stable occupied by the same thoroughbreds. First, prohibition had to be introduced into the United States. This was done by the British East India Company heirs, who, acting upon experience gained through the well-documented China Inland Mission records found in India House, set up the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, supposedly to oppose consumption of alcohol in America. We say that history repeats itself, and in a sense, this is true except that it repeats itself in an ever-upward spiral. Today we find that some of the largest companies, allegedly polluting the earth, are the largest contributors of funds to the environmentalist movement. The big names send forth their message. Prince Philip is one of their heroes, yet his son Prince Charles owns 1 million acres of forested land in Wales from which timber is regularly harvested and, in addition, Prince Charles is one of the largest owners of slum housing in London, where pollution thrives. In the case of those who railed against the evils of drink, we find they were financed by the Astors, the Rockefellers, the Spelmans, the Vanderbilts and the Warburgs, who had a vested interest in the liquor trade. On the instructions of the Crown, Lord Beaverbrook came over from England to tell these wealthy American families that they were to invest in the WCTU. It was the same Lord Beaverbrook who came to Washington in 1940 and ordered Roosevelt to get involved in Britain's war. Roosevelt complied by stationing a U.S. Navy flotilla in Greenland that spent the 9 months prior to Pearl Harbor hunting and attacking German U-boats. Like his successor, George Bush, Roosevelt thought the Congress a confounded nuisance, so, acting like a king, a sense he felt strongly since he is related to the British royal family, FDR never sought the permission of Congress for his illegal action. This is what the British are most fond of referring to as their special relationship with America. The drug trade has a connection with the murder of President John F. Kennedy, which foul deed stains the national character and will continue to do so until the perpetrators are found and brought to justice. There is proof that the Mafia was involved in this through the CIA, which brings to mind that it all started with the old Meyer Lansky network, which evolved into the Irgun terrorist organization, and Lansky proved to be one of the best vehicles for peddling cultural warfare against the West. Lansky was, through more respectable fronts, associated with the British higher-ups in bringing gambling and dope distribution to Paradise Island in the Bahamas under the cover of the Mary Carter Paint Company, a joint Lansky-British MI6 venture. Lord Sassoon was later murdered because he was skimming money and was threatening to blow the whistle if he was punished. Ray Wolfe was more presentable, representing the Bronfmans of Canada. While the Bronfmans were not privy to Churchill's massive Nova Scotia project, they were and still are nevertheless an important asset of the British royal family in the business of dope peddling. Sam Rothberg, close associate of Meyer Lansky, also worked with Thibaut Rosenbaum and Pinchas Sapir, all kingpins in the Lansky drug ring. Rosenbaum ran a drug money laundering operation out of Switzerland through a bank he established for this purpose, Banque du Crédit International. The bank quickly expanded its activities and became the principal bank used by Lansky and his mobster associates for laundering money garnered from prostitution, drugs and other mafia rackets. It is worthy of note that Thibaut Rosenbaum's bank was used by the shadowy chief of British intelligence, Sir William Stevenson, whose right-hand man, Major John Mortimer Bloomfield, a Canadian citizen, ran Division 5 of the FBI throughout the Second World War. Stevenson was an early member of the 20th century the Committee of 300, although Bloomfield never made it that far. As I revealed in my series of monographs on the Kennedy assassination, it was Stevenson who masterminded the operation, which was run as a hands-on project by Bloomfield. Fronting for the Kennedy assassination was done through another drug-related front, Permanent Industrial Expositions, PIMINDEX, created in 1957 and centered in the World Trade Mart building in downtown New Orleans. Bloomfield just happened to be the attorney for the Bronfman family. The World Trade Mart was created by Colonel Clay Shaw and FBI Division 5 Station Chief in New Orleans, Guy Bannister. Shaw and Bannister were close associates of Lee Harvey Oswald, accused of shooting Kennedy, who was murdered by CIA contract agent Jack Ruby before he could prove that he was not the assassin who shot President Kennedy. In spite of the Warren Commission and numerous official reports, it has never been established that Oswald owned the Mannlicher rifle said to be the murder weapon. It was not, nor that he had ever fired it. The connection between the drug trade, Shaw, Bannister and Bloomfield has been established several times, and need not concern us here. In the immediate post-World War II period, one of the most common methods used by Resorts International and other drug-related companies to clean money was by courier service to a money laundering bank. Now all that has changed. Only the small fry still use such a risky method. The big fish conduit their money via the CHIPS system, an acronym for Clearinghouse International Payments System, run by a Burroughs computer system centered at the New York Clearinghouse. 12 of the largest banks use this system. One of them is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. Another is Credit Suisse, that so respectable paragon of virtue in banking, until the lid is lifted. Combined with the SWIFT system based in Virginia, dirty drug money becomes invisible. Only wanton carelessness results in the FBI getting lucky now and then, if and when it is told not to look the other way. Only low-echelon drug dealers get caught with drug money in their hands. The elite, Drexel Burnham, Credit Suisse, Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, escape detection. But this, too, is changing with the collapse of Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, which is likely to expose a great deal about the drug trade if ever a proper investigation is carried out. One of the largest assets in the portfolio of the Committee of 300 companies is American Express, Amex. Its presidents regularly occupy positions on the Committee of 300. I first got interested in Amex when I was carrying out an on-the-spot investigation that led me to the Trade Development Bank in Geneva. Later, this got me into a lot of trouble. I discovered that Trade Development Bank, then run by Edmund Safra, key man in the gold for opium trade, was supplying tons of gold to the Hong Kong market via Trade Development Bank. Before going to Switzerland, I went to Pretoria, South Africa, where I talked with Dr. Chris Stals, at that time the Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, which controls all bulk dealings in South African produced gold. After several discussions over a period of a week, I was told that the bank could not supply me with the 10 tons of gold that I was authorized to buy on behalf of clients I was supposed to be representing. My friends in the right places knew how to produce the documentation which passed without question. The Reserve Bank referred me to a Swiss company whom I cannot name, because it would blow cover. I was also given the address of Trade Development Bank in Geneva. The purpose of my exercise was to find out the mechanics of how gold is moved and traded, and secondly to test bogus documents which had been prepared for me by ex-intelligence friends of mine who specialized in this kind of thing. Remember M in the James Bond series? Let me assure you that M does exist, only his correct initial is C. The documents I had consisted of buying orders from Liechtenstein companies, with supporting papers to match. On approaching Trade Development Bank I was at first greeted cordially, but, as discussions progressed with more and more suspicion until, when I felt it was no longer safe for me to visit the bank, without telling anyone at the bank, I left Geneva. Later the bank was sold to American Express. American Express was briefly investigated by former Attorney General Edwin Meese, after which he was quickly removed from office and labeled corrupt. What I found was that American Express was and still is a conduit for laundering drug money, and, thus far, no one has been able to explain to me why a private company has the right to print dollars. Aren't American Express travelers' checks dollars? I subsequently exposed the Safra-Amex drug connections, which upset a lot of people, as can be imagined. The Committee of 300 member, Jaffet, controls Charterhouse Jaffet, which in turn controls Jardine Matheson as a direct link to the Hong Kong opium trade. The Jaffets are reportedly English Quakers. The Matheson family, also members of the Committee of 300, were kingpins in the China opium trade, at least up until 1943. The Mathesons have appeared in the Queen of England honours lists since the early 19th century. The top controllers of the drug trade in the Committee of 300 have no conscience about the millions of lives they ruin each year. They are Gnostics, Cathars, members of the cult of Dionysus, Osiris, or worse. To them, ordinary people are there to be used for their purposes. Their high priests, Bulwer-Lytton and Aldous Huxley, preached the gospel of drugs as a beneficial substance. To quote Huxley, and for private everyday use, there have always been chemical intoxicants. All the vegetable sedatives and narcotics, all the euphorics that grow on trees, the hallucinogens that ripen in berries, have been used by humans since time immemorial. And to these modifiers of conscience, modern science has added its quota of synthetics. For unrestricted use the West has permitted only alcohol and tobacco. All other chemical doors in the wall are labeled dope. To the oligarchs and plutocrats of the Committee of 300, drugs have a twofold purpose: firstly to bring in colossal sums of money, and secondly, to eventually turn a major part of the population into mindless drug zombies who will be easier to control than people who don't need drugs. As punishment for rebellion will mean withholding of supplies of heroin, cocaine, marijuana, etc. For this it is necessary to legalize drugs so that a monopoly system, which has been readied for introduction once severe economic conditions, of which the 1991 depression is the forerunner, caused drug usage to proliferate as hundreds of thousands of permanently jobless workers turned to drugs for solace. In one of the Royal Institute of International Affairs top-secret papers, the scenario is laid out as follows: in part having been failed by Christianity, and with unemployment on every hand, those who have been without jobs for 5 years or more will turn away from the church and seek solace in drugs. That is when full control of the drug trade must be completed in order that the governments of all countries who are under our jurisdiction will have a monopoly which we will control through supply. Drug bars will take care of the unruly and the discontent. Would-be revolutionaries will be turned into harmless addicts with no will their own. There is ample evidence that the CIA and British intelligence, especially MI6, have already spent at least a decade working toward this goal. The Royal Institute of International Affairs used the lifetime work of Aldous Huxley and Bulwer Lytton as its blueprint to bring about a state where mankind will no longer have wills of their own in the one world government new world order of the fast approaching new dark age. Again, let us see what High Priest Aldous Huxley had to say about this. In many societies at many levels of civilization, attempts have been made to fuse drug intoxication with God intoxication. In ancient Greece, for example, ethyl alcohol had its place in the established religions. Dionysus, Bacchus, as he was often called, was a true divinity. Complete prohibition of chemical changes can be decreed but cannot be enforced. The language of the PRO drug lobby on Capitol Hill. Now let us consider another type of drug, still undiscovered, but probably just around the corner. A drug making people happy in situations where they would normally feel miserable. Is there anyone more miserable than a person who has sought and been unable to find work? Such a drug would be a blessing, but a blessing fraught with grave social and political dangers. By making a harmless chemical euphoria freely available, a dictator could reconcile an entire population to a state of affairs to which self-respecting human plus beings ought not to be reconciled. Quite a dialectical masterpiece. What Huxley was advocating and which is official policy of the Committee of 300 and its surrogate, RIIA, can be quite simply stated as mass mind control. As I have often said, all wars are wars for the souls of mankind. Thus far it has not dawned on us that the drug trade is irregular low-intensity warfare against the whole human race of free men. Irregular warfare is the most terrible form of warfare which, while it has a beginning, has no ending. Some will question the involvement of the British royal families, past and present, in the drug trade. To see it in print appears on the surface to be preposterous, and it is being seen in print more often these days to make it appear exactly that, preposterous. The oldest maxim in the intelligence business is, if you want to hide something, put it where everyone can see it. F.S. Turner's book, British Opium Policy, published in 1876, shows how the British monarchy and its hangers-on family relatives were deeply involved in the opium trade. Turner was the secretary of the Anglo-Oriental Society of the Suppression of the Opium Trade. He declined to be silenced by Crown spokesperson Sir Art Temple. Turner stated that the government, and therefore the Crown, had to withdraw from the opium monopoly, and if it takes any revenues at all, take only that which accrues from taxation honestly meant to have a restrictive force. Turner was answered by a spokesman for the monarchy, Lord Lawrence, who fought against the beak losing its monopoly. It would be desirable to get rid of the monopoly, but I myself am disinclined to be the agent of change. If it is a question of moderate loss that we could afford, I would not hesitate to undertake it. Taken from the Calcutta Papers 1870, by 1874 the war against the British monarchy and the aristocracy over its deep involvement in the China opium trade was getting heated. The Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade violently assailed the aristocracy of the day and pressed home its attacks in a fearless manner we would do well to emulate. The Society said that the Treaty of Shenzhen, which forced China to accept the importation of enormous amounts of opium, was a dastardly crime against the Chinese people. There arose a mighty warrior, Joseph Grundy Alexander, a barrister by profession who, in 1866, led a strong attack on British Crown opium policy in China in which he openly mentioned the involvement of the royal family and the aristocracy. For the first time Alexander brought India, the jewel in the crown, into the picture. He laid the blame squarely where it belonged, on the monarchy, the so-called aristocracy and its servants in the British government. Under the direction of Alexander, the Society committed itself to the total destruction of the cultivation of opium poppies in Bengal, India. Alexander proved to be a doughty opponent. Through his leadership, the Drug aristocracy began to falter and, in the face of his open denouncements of the royal family and its hangers-on, several members of parliament began siding with him, conservatives, unionists, labor. Alexander made it clear that the drug trade was not a party political issue, it was for all parties to join together in helping to eradicate the menace. Lord Kimberley, spokesman for the royal family and the entrenched oligarchists, threatened that any attempts to interfere with what he called the commerce of the nation, will run into serious opposition from the cabinet. Alexander and his society pressed on in the face of innumerable threats and finally Parliament agreed to appoint a royal commission to inquire into the opium trade, with Lord Kimberley, who was Secretary of India, as its chairman. A more inappropriate person to head the commission could not have been found. It was akin to Dulles being appointed to the Warrant Commission. In his first statement, Lord Kimberley made it clear that he would rather resign from his august position than consent to a resolution that would surrender Indian opium revenues. It is worthy of note that Indian opium revenue implied money shared by the nation. Like the idea that the people of South Africa share in the enormous profits from the sale of gold and diamonds, this was just not the case. Indian opium revenues went straight into the royal coffers and the pockets of the nobility and the oligarchists and plutocrats, and made them billionaires. Rowntrie's book, The Imperial Drug Trade, gives a fascinating account of how Prime Minister Gladstone and his fellow plutocrats lied, cheated, twisted and turned, to keep the astonishing truth of the involvement of the British monarchy in the opium trade from being exposed. Rowntrie's book is a treasure house of information on the deep involvement of the British royal family and the lords and ladies of England and the huge fortunes they accumulated from the misery of the Chinese opium addicts. Lord Kimberley, Secretary of the Commission of Inquiry, was himself deeply involved in the opium trade, so he did everything in his power to close the proceedings to all who sought the truth. Finally, under a great deal of pressure from the public, the Royal Commission was forced to open the door to this inquiry just a crack, so that it became apparent that the highest in the land were running the opium trade and receiving huge benefits from it. But the door was quickly slammed shut again, and the Royal Commission called no expert witnesses, thereafter sitting for an absurdly short period of time. The Commission was nothing but a farce and a cover-up, such as we have become accustomed to in 20th century America. The Eastern liberal establishment families of the United States were just as deeply involved in the China opium trade as were the British. Indeed, they still are. Witness recent history when James Earl Carter toppled the Shah of Iran. Why was the Shah deposed and then murdered by the United States government? In a word, because of drugs. The Shah had clamped down and virtually put an end to the immensely lucrative opium trade being conducted out of Iran by the British. At the time that the Shah took over in Iran, there were already 1 million opium, heroin addicts. This the British would not tolerate, so they sent the United States to do their dirty work for them in terms of the special relationship between the two countries. When Khomeini took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, arms sales by the United States, which had begun with the Shah, were not discontinued. Why not? Had the United States done so, Khomeini would have cancelled the British monopoly of the opium trade in his country. To prove the point, after 1984, Khomeini's liberal attitude toward opium had increased the number of addicts to 2 million, according to United Nations and World Health Organization statistics. Both President Carter and his successor, Ronald Reagan, willingly and with full knowledge of what was at stake, went on supplying arms to Iran even while American hostages languished in captivity. In 1980 I wrote a monograph under the title, What Really Happened in Iran, which set out the facts. The arms trade with Iran was sealed at a meeting between Cyrus Vance, a servant of the Committee of 300, and Dr. Hashemi, which resulted in the U.S. Air Force beginning an immediate airlift of arms to Iran, carried on even at the height of the hostage crisis. The arms came from U.S. Army stockpiles in Germany and some were even flown directly from the United States with refueling stops at the Azores. With the advent of Khomeini, who was put in power in Iran by the Committee of 300, opium production skyrocketed. By 1984 Iran's opium production exceeded 650 metric tons of opium per annum. What Carter and Reagan did was ensure that there was no further interference in the opium trade, and they carried out the mandate given to them by the oligarchical families in Britain in this connection. Iran presently rivals the Golden Triangle in the volume of opium produced. The Shah was not the only victim of the Committee of 300. William Buckley, CIA station chief in Beirut, in all his lack of experience on who is behind the opium trade, began conducting investigations in Iran, Lebanon and even spent time in Pakistan. From Islamabad, Buckley began sending back damning reports to the CIA in Langley about the burgeoning opium trade in the Golden Crescent and Pakistan. The U.S. Embassy in Islamabad was firebombed, but Buckley escaped the mob attack and returned to Washington because his cover was blown by forces unknown. Then a very strange thing happened. Contrary to all procedures laid down by the CIA when an agent's cover has been blown, Buckley was sent back to Beirut. Buckley was in effect sentenced to death by the CIA in order to silence him, and this time the sentence was carried out. William Buckley was kidnapped by agents of the Committee of 300. Under brutal interrogation by General Mohammed el-Kouili of Syrian intelligence to force him to disclose the names of all field officers of the DIA in these countries, he was brutally murdered. His efforts to expose the huge opium trade developing out of Pakistan, Lebanon and Iran cost Buckley his life. If the remaining free men in this world believe that single-handedly or in small groups they can smash the drug trade, they are sorely mistaken. They could cut off the tentacles of the opium and cocaine trade here and there, but never the head. The crowned cobras of Europe and their Eastern liberal establishment family will not tolerate it. The war on drugs which the Bush administration is allegedly fighting, but which it is not, is for total legalization of all types and classes of drugs. Such drugs are not solely a social aberration, but a full-scale attempt to gain control of the minds of the people of this planet, or as the Aquarian conspiracy authors put it, to bring about radical changes in the United States. This is the principal task of the Committee of 300, the ultimate secret society. Nothing has changed in the opium heroin cocaine trade. It is still run by the same upper-class families in Britain and the United States. It is still a fabulously profitable trade where what seem to be big losses through seizures by the authorities are written off in panelled boardrooms in New York, Hong Kong and London over port and cigars as merely the cost of doing business, old boy. British colonial capitalism has always been the mainstay of the oligarchical feudal system of privilege in England and remains so to the present day. When the poor, untutored pastoral people in South Africa who became known as the Boers fell into the blood-stained hands of the British aristocracy in 1899, they had no idea that the revoltingly cruel war so relentlessly pursued by Queen Victoria, was financed by the incredible amounts of money which came from the instant fortunes of the beak opium trade in China into the pockets of the plutocrats. The committee of 300 members Cecil John Rhodes, Barney Barnato and Alfred Beat instigated and engineered the war. Rhodes was the principal agent for the Rothschilds, whose banks were awash in cash flowing from the opium trade. These robbers, thieves and liars, Rhodes, Barnato, Oppenheimer, Joel and Beat, dispossessed the South African Boers of their birthright, the gold and diamonds that lay beneath their soil. The South African Boers received nothing out of the billions upon billions of dollars derived from the sale of their gold and diamonds. The Committee of 300 quickly took full control of these vast treasures, control which it even now maintains through one of its members, Sir Harry Oppenheimer. The average South African receives $100 per annum per capita from the gold and diamond industry. The billions which flow out annually go to the bankers of the Committee of 300. It is one of the most foul and vile stories of greed, theft and the murder of a nation ever recorded in the annals of history. How could the British Crown have succeeded in pulling off this stunning fraud of gigantic proportion? To accomplish such a Herculean task requires skilled organizing with devoted agents in place to carry out the daily instructions passed down from the conspirators' hierarchy. The first step was a press propaganda campaign portraying the Boers as uncivilized barbarians, only slightly human, who were denying British citizens the right to vote in the Boer Republic. Then, demands were made on Paul Kruger, leader of the Transvaal Republic, which of course could not be met. After that, a series of incidents were staged to provoke the Boers into retaliation, but that didn't work either. Then came the infamous Jameson raid, where a certain Jameson led a party of several hundred armed men in an attack on the Transvaal. War followed immediately thereafter. Queen Victoria mounted the largest and best equipped army that the world had ever seen at that time, 1898. Victoria thought the war would be over in 2 weeks, since the Boers had no standing army and no trained militia and would be no match for her 400,000 soldiers drawn from the ranks of Britain's underclasses. The Boers never numbered more than 80,000 farmers and their sons, some were as young as 14. Rudyard Kipling also thought the war would be over in less than a week. Instead, with rifle in one hand and the Bible in the other, the Boers held out for 3 years. "We went to South Africa thinking the war would be over in a week," said Kipling. Instead, the Boers taught us no end of a lesson. That same lesson could be taught to the Committee of 300 today if we could but muster 10,000 leaders, good men and true, to lead this nation in battle against the gargantuan monster threatening to devour everything our Constitution stands for. After the war ended in 1902, the British Crown had to consolidate its grip on the unimaginable fortune of gold and diamonds that lay beneath the barren veldt of the Boer republics of Transvaal and Orange Free State. This was done through the Roundtable of the legend of King Arthur and his knights. The Roundtable is strictly a British MI6 intelligence operation established by the Committee of 300, which, together with the Rhodes Scholarship Program, is a dagger in the heartland of America. The Roundtable was established in South Africa by Cecil Rhodes and funded by the English Rothschild family. Its purpose was to train business leaders loyal to the British Crown who would secure vast gold and diamond treasures for the British Crown. South Africans had their birthright stolen from them in a coup so massive and all-pervading that it was apparent only a central unified command could have pulled it off. That unified command was the Committee of 300. That this was accomplished is not in dispute. By the early 1930s, the British Crown had a stranglehold on the biggest supplies of gold and diamonds ever found in the world. Now the Committee of 300 had at its disposal both the vast fortune coming from the drug trade and the equally vast fortune of the mineral and metal wealth of South Africa. Financial control of the world was complete. The Roundtable played a pivotal role in the coup. The express purpose of the Roundtable, after swallowing up South Africa, was to blunt the benefits to the United States of the American War of Independence, and once more bring the United States under British control. Organizing ability was essential for such an enterprise, and it was provided by Lord Alfred Milner, protégé of the London Rothschild family. using Scottish Rite Freemason principles in selecting the members of Roundtable. Those chosen underwent a period of intense training at Cambridge and Oxford universities under the watchful eyes of John Ruskin, a self-confessed old-school communist, and T.H. Green, an operative of MI6. It was Green, the son of a Christian evangelical cleric, who spawned Rhodes, Milner, John Wheeler Bennett, A.D. Lindsay, George Bernard Shaw and Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's finance minister. I pause here to remind readers that the Round Table is only one sector of this vast and all-encompassing the Committee of 300. Yet the Round Table itself consists of a maze of companies, institutions, banks and educational establishments, which in itself would take qualified insurance actuaries a year to sort out. Roundtablers found out throughout the world to take control of fiscal and monetary policies and political leadership in all countries where they operated. In South Africa, General Smuts, who had fought against the 108 British in the Boer War, was turned and became a leading British intelligence, military and political agent who espoused the cause of the British Crown. In the United States, in later years, the task of boring away at the United States from the inside fell to William Yandell Elliott, the man who spawned Henry Kissinger and who was responsible for his meteoric rise to power as chief U.S. advisor to the Committee of 300. William Yandell Elliott was an American at Oxford. President William Jefferson Clinton was also an American at Oxford, who had already served the Committee of 300 well, which is a prerequisite for higher office in the service of the committee. After graduating from Vanderbilt University in 1917, Elliott was drafted by the Rothschild-Warburg banking network. He worked at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco and rose to be a director. From there he acted as a Warburg-Rothschild intelligence officer, reporting on the important areas of the United States he was overseeing. Elliott's Freemason talent spotters recommended him for a Rhodes Scholarship and, in 1923, he went to Balliol College at Oxford University, whose dreaming spires hid a network of intrigue and future traitors to the west. Balliol College was, and still is, the center of recruiting for the Round Table. After a thorough brainwashing conducted by the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations representative, A.D. Lindsay, who had succeeded Master of Balliol T.H. Green, Elliott was received into the Round Table and sent to the Royal Institute of International Affairs to be given his assignment, which was that he return to the United States to become a leader in the academic community. The Round Table's driving philosophy was to have Roundtablers in positions to formulate and carry out social policies through social institutions whereby what Ruskin called the masses could be manipulated. Members infiltrated the highest levels of banking after undergoing a course at the Tavistock Institute. The course was drawn up by Lord Leconfield, an intimate of the British royal family, and later run by Robert Brand, who went on to manage Lazard Freers. The Royal Institute of International Affairs was and remains totally interfaced with the British monarchy. Some of the spin-offs of the Round Table are the Bilderbergers, set up and run by Duncan Sandys, a prominent politician and son-in-law of the late Winston Churchill, the Ditchley Foundation, a secret bankers club which I exposed in my 1983 work, International Bankers Conspiracy, the Ditchley Foundation, the Trilateral Commission, the Atlantic Council of the United States and the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, whose well-hidden, behind-the-scenes founder was Lord Bullock of the RIIA, for whom Robert Anderson fronted. The way in which Henry Kissinger, the RIIA's chief asset in the United States, came to power is a story of the triumph of the institution of the British monarchy over the Republic of the United States of America. It is a tale of horror, too long to be included here. Nevertheless, it would be remiss of me if I did not mention just a few of the highlights of Kissinger's rise to fame, fortune and power. After a stint in the United States Army, beginning with the job of driving General Fritz Kremer around war-torn Germany, thanks to the Oppenheimer family, Kissinger was picked to attend Wilton Park for further training. At the time he held the rank of private first class. In 1952 Kissinger was sent to the Tavistock Institute, where R.V. Dix took him in hand and turned him inside out. Thereafter there was no holding Kissinger back. He was later drafted to serve under George Franklin and Hamilton Fish of the Council on Foreign Relations New York office. It is believed that the official nuclear policy adopted by the United States was delivered to Kissinger during his stay at Tavistock and further shaped by his participation in nuclear weapons and foreign policy, a roundtable seminar which brought forth the doctrine known as flexible response, a total irrationality, which became known by the acronym MAD. Thanks to William Yandell Elliott and under the tutelage of John Wheeler Bennett, top intelligence director of the Roundtable and chief of MI6 field operations in the United States, Kissinger became Elliott's favorite son, as he explained in his book, The Pragmatic Revolt in Politics. Kissinger was co-opted into the Roundtable to push monetarist policies he studied at Harvard International Seminars. Kissinger avidly absorbed Elliott's teachings and was no longer recognizable as the man General Kramer once described as "my little Jew boy driver." Kissinger was inculcated with the spirit of the master of Balliol, becoming an ardent disciple of decadent British aristocracy. Adopting the philosophies of Toynbee, chief intelligence director for MI6 at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Kissinger used its papers to write his undergraduate dissertation. By the mid-1960s, Kissinger had proved his worth to the Roundtable and the RIIA, and thus to the British monarchy. As a reward and a test of what he had learned, Kissinger was placed in charge of a small group consisting of James Schlesinger, Alexander Haig and Daniel Ellsberg, that the Roundtable was using to conduct a series of experiments. Cooperating with this group was the Institute of Policy Studies chief theoretician Noam Chomsky. Haig, like Kissinger, worked for General Kramer, albeit not as a driver, and the general found a number of varied openings in the Department of Defense for his protégé. Once Kissinger was installed as National Security Advisor, Kramer got Haig the job as his deputy. Ellsberg, Haig, and Kissinger then set in motion the RIIA's Watergate plan to oust President Nixon for disobeying direct instructions. Haig played the lead role in brainwashing and confusing President Nixon, and in effect it was Kissinger who ran the White House during this softening up of the president. As I mentioned in 1984, Haig was the White House go-between known as Deep Throat, passing information to the Washington Post team of Woodward and Bernstein. The Watergating of Nixon was the biggest coup yet pulled off by the Roundtable as an agency and an arm of the RIIA. All the tangled threads led back to the Roundtable, from there to the RIIA, and right back to the Queen of England. The humiliation of Nixon was an object lesson and a warning to future presidents of the United States not to imagine they could go against the Committee of 300 and win. Kennedy was brutally murdered in full view of the American people for the same reason. Nixon was not considered worthy enough to suffer the same fate as John F. Kennedy. But whatever the method used, the Committee of 300 made sure that all would-be aspirants for the White House got the message, nobody is beyond our reach. That this message remains just as forceful as it was when Kennedy was murdered and Nixon hounded out of office, is evidenced by the character of President George Bush, whose eagerness to please his masters should be cause for grave concern among those who worry about the future of the United States. The purpose of the exercise was made clear in the Pentagon Papers episode and the drafting of Schlesinger into the Nixon administration to act as a spoiler in the defense establishment and a counterforce to the development of atomic energy, which role Schlesinger carried out from the shelter of his position in the Atomic Energy Commission, one of the key factors in deindustrializing the United States in the planned Club of Rome post-industrial zero-growth strategies. From this beginning we can trace the roots of the 1991 depression which has thus far cost the jobs of 30 million Americans. It is virtually impossible to penetrate the Committee of 300 and the oligarchical families that go to make it up. The camouflage they pull over themselves as protective covering is very hard to rip off. This fact should be noted by every freedom-loving American. The Committee of 300 dictates what passes for United States foreign and domestic policies and has done so for over 200 years. Nowhere was this more strikingly portrayed than when a cocky President Truman had the wind knocked out of him by Churchill ramrodding the so-called Truman Doctrine down the throat of the little man from Independence, Missouri. Some of their former members, whose descendants filled vacancies caused by death, and present members include Sir Mark Turner, Gerald Villiers, Samuel Montague, the Entgapes, Keswicks, Peases, Schroeders, Airleys, Churches, Frasers, Lazars and Jardine Mathesons. The full list of members is presented elsewhere in this book. These people on the committee ordered President Wilson to go to war against Germany in the First World War. This committee ordered Roosevelt to engineer the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor with the object of getting the United States into the Second World War. These people, this committee, ordered this nation to war in Korea, Vietnam and the Persian Gulf. The plain truth is that the United States has fought in 5 wars this century for and on behalf of the infamous the Committee of 300. It seems that, apart from just a few, no one has stopped to ask, why are we fighting these wars? The big drum of patriotism, martial music and waving flags and yellow ribbons, it seems, caused a great nation to become bereft of its senses. On the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, a new hated Japan campaign is being waged, not by the Institute of Pacific Relations, IPR, but in the most direct and brazen manner by the Bush administration and the Congress. The object is the same as it was when Roosevelt inspired the attack on Pearl Harbor: paint the Japanese as aggressors and wage economic war, then ready our forces for the next phase, armed aggression against Japan. This is already in the works. It is only a matter of time before more of our sons and daughters are sent off to be slaughtered in the service of the feudal lords of the Committee of 300. We ought to shout from the housetops, it is not for freedom nor for love of country that we are going to die, but for a system of tyranny that will shortly envelop the entire world. So tight is the grip of this organization on Britain that 95% of British citizens have, since the 1700s, been forced to accept as their share, less than 20% of the national wealth of the country. This is what the oligarchical feudal lords of England like to call democracy. These nice, proper English gentlemen are, in reality, utterly ruthless. What they did in India, Sudan, Egypt, Iraq, Iran and Turkey will be repeated in every country under the New World Order one world government. They will use every nation and its wealth to protect their privileged way of life. It is this class of British aristocracy whose fortunes are inextricably woven and intertwined with the drug trade, the gold, diamond and arms trades, banking, commerce and industry, oil, the news media and entertainment industry. Apart from the rank and file of the Labour Party, but not its leaders, the majority of British political leaders are descendants of titled families, the titles being hereditary and handed down from father to eldest son. This system ensures that no outsiders aspire to political power in England. Nevertheless, some aliens have been able to squeeze their way in. Take the case of Lord Halifax, former British ambassador to Washington and the man who delivered the Committee of 300 orders to our government during the Second World War. Halifax's son, Charles Wood, married a Miss Primrose, a blood relative of Lord Rothschild. Behind such names as Lord Swatling is hidden the name of Montague, director at the Bank of England and advisor and confidant of the majority stockholder of the Shell Oil Company, Queen Elizabeth II. All are members of the Committee of 300. Some of the old barriers have been broken down. Title is today not the only criteria for admission to the Club of Rome. It is appropriate to provide an overview of what the Committee of 300 hopes to achieve, what its aims and objectives are before we proceed to its vast, far-flung interlocking interfacing of banks, insurance companies, corporations, etc. The following information has taken years of investigative 112 research to put together from hundreds of documents and sources of mine who gave me access to some of the papers in which the details are hidden. The Committee of 300 consists of certain individuals, specialists in their own fields, including cultus diabolicus, mind-altering drugs, and specialists in murder by poison, intelligence, banking, and every facet of commercial activity. It will be necessary to mention former members since deceased, because of their former roles and because their places were given to family members of new members considered worthy of the honor. Included in the membership are the old families of the European black nobility, the American Eastern liberal establishment, in Freemason hierarchy and the Order of Skull and Bone, the Illuminati, or as it is known by the Committee Moriah Conquering Wind, the Mumma Group, the National and World Council of Churches, the Circle of Initiates, the Nine Unknown Men, Lucy's Trust, Jesuit Liberation Theologists, the Order of the Elders of Zion, the Nazi Princes, International Monetary Fund, IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, the United Nations, UN, the Central, British Quater Coronati, Italian P2 Masonry, especially those in the Vatican hierarchy, the Central Intelligence Agency, Tavistock Institute selected personnel, various members of leading foundations and insurance companies named in the lists that follow, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, the Milner Group Roundtable, Cine Foundation, German Marshall Fund, Ditchley Foundation, NATO, Club of Rome, Environmentalists, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, One World Government Church, Socialist International, Black Order, Thule Society, and Unhappy Rosicrucianists, the Great Superior Ones, and literally hundreds of other organizations. What then are we looking at? A loosely knit gathering of people with weird ideas? Certainly not. In the Committee of 300, which has a 150-year history, we have some of the most brilliant intellects assembled to form a completely totalitarian, absolutely controlled new society. Only it isn't new, having drawn most of its ideas from the clubs of cultus diabolicus. It strives toward a one-world government rather well described by one of its late members, H. G. Wells, in his work commissioned by the committee which Wells boldly called, The Open Conspiracy, Plans for a World Revolution. It was a bold statement of intent, but not really so bold since nobody believed Wells except the great superior ones, the Ananhubs and those who are what we would call insiders today. Here is an extract of what Wells proposed. The Open Conspiracy will appear first, I believe, as a conscious organization of intelligent, and in some cases wealthy men, as a movement having distinct social and political aims, confessedly ignoring most of the existing apparatus of political control, or using it only as an incidental implement in the stages, a mere movement of a number of people in a certain direction, who will presently discover, with a sort of a surprise, the common object toward which they are all moving. In all sorts of ways, they will be influencing and controlling the ostensible government. Like George Orwell's 1984, Wells' account is a mass appeal for a one-world government. Summarized, the intent and purpose of the Committee of 300 Island to bring to pass the following conditions: a one-world government and one-unit monetary system under permanent non-elected hereditary oligarchists who self-select from among their numbers in the form of a feudal system as it was in the Middle Ages. In this one-world entity, population will be limited by restrictions on the number of children per family, diseases, wars, famines, until 1 billion people who are useful to the ruling class, in areas which will be strictly and clearly defined, remain as the total world population. There will be no middle class, only rulers and servants. All laws will be uniform under a legal system of world courts practicing the same unified code of laws, backed up by a one-world government police force and a one-world unified military to enforce laws in all former countries where no national boundaries shall exist. The system will be on the basis of a welfare state. Those who are obedient and subservient to the one-world government will be rewarded with the means to live. Those who are rebellious will simply be starved to death or be declared outlaws, thus a target for anyone who wishes to kill them. Privately owned firearms or weapons of any kind will be prohibited. Only one religion will be allowed, and that will be in the form of a one-world government church, which has been in existence since 1920, as we shall see. Satanism, Luciferianism and witchcraft shall be recognized as legitimate one-world government curricula with no private or church schools. All Christian churches have already been subverted, and Christianity will be a thing of the past in the one-world government. To induce a state where there is no individual freedom or any concept of liberty surviving, there shall be no such thing as republicanism, sovereignty or rights residing with the people. National pride and racial identity shall be stamped out, and in the transition phase it shall be subject to the severest penalties to even mention one's racial origin. Each person shall be fully indoctrinated that he or she is a creature of the one world government, with an identification number clearly marked on their person so as to be readily accessible, which identifying number shall be in the master file of the NATO computer in Brussels, Belgium, subject to instant retrieval by any agency of the one world government at any time. The master files of the CIA, FBI, state and local police agencies, IRS, FEMA, Social Security shall be vastly expanded and form the basis of personnel records of all individuals in the United States. Marriage shall be outlawed, and there shall be no family life as we know it. Children will be removed from their parents at an early age and brought up by wards as state property. Such an experiment was carried out in East Germany under Erich Honecker, when children were taken away from parents considered by the state to be disloyal citizens. Women will be degraded through the continued process of women's liberation movements. Free sex shall be mandatory. Failure to comply at least once by the age of 20 shall be punishable by severe reprisals against her person. Self-abortion shall be taught and practiced after 2 children are born to a woman. Such records shall be contained in the personnel file of each woman in the one world government's regional computers. If a woman falls pregnant after she has previously given birth to 2 children, she shall be forcibly removed to an abortion clinic for such an abortion and sterilization to be carried out. Pornography shall be promoted and be compulsory showing in every theater of cinema, including homosexual and lesbian pornography. The use of recreational drugs shall be compulsory, with each person allotted drug quotas which can be purchased at one world government stores throughout the world. Mind control drugs will be expanded and usage become compulsory. Such mind control drugs shall be given in food and or water supplies without the knowledge and or consent of the people. Drug bars shall be set up, run by one world government employees, where the slave class shall be able to spend their free time. In this manner the non-elite masses will be reduced to the level and behavior of controlled animals with no will of their own and easily regimented and controlled. The economic system shall be based upon the ruling oligarchical class allowing just enough foods and services to be produced to keep the mass slave labor camps going. All wealth shall be aggregated in the hands of the elite members of the Committee of 300. Each individual shall be indoctrinated to understand that he or she is totally dependent upon the state for survival. The world shall be ruled by Committee of 300 executive decrees which become instant law. Boris Yeltsin is using the Committee of 300 decrees to impose the committee's will on Russia as a trial run. Courts of punishment and not courts of justice shall exist. Industry is to be totally destroyed along with nuclear-powered energy systems. Only the Committee of 300 members and their elitists shall have the right to any of the Earth's resources. Agriculture shall be solely in the hands of the Committee of 300 with food production strictly controlled. As these measures begin to take effect, large populations in the cities shall be forcibly removed to remote areas and those who refuse to go shall be exterminated in the manner of the one world government experiment carried out by Pol Pot in Cambodia. Euthanasia for the terminally ill and the aged shall be compulsory. No cities shall be larger than a predetermined number as described in the work of Calgary. Essential workers will be moved to other cities if the one they are in becomes overpopulated. Other non-essential workers will be chosen at random and sent to underpopulated cities to fill quotas. At least 4 billion useless eaters shall be eliminated by the year 2050 by means of limited wars, organized epidemics of fatal rapid-acting diseases and starvation. Energy, food and water shall be kept at subsistence levels for the non-elite, starting with the white populations of Western Europe and North America and then spreading to other races. The population of Canada, Western Europe and the United States will be decimated more rapidly than on other continents, until the world's population reaches a manageable level of 1 billion, of which 500 million will consist of Chinese and Japanese races, selected because they are people who have been regimented for centuries and who are accustomed to obeying authority without question. From time to time there shall be artificially contrived food and water shortages and the medical care to remind the masses that their very existence depends on the goodwill of the Committee of 300. After the destruction of housing, auto, steel and heavy goods industries, there shall be limited housing, and industries of any kind allowed to remain shall be under the direction of NATO's Club of Rome, as shall all scientific and space exploration development, limited to the elite under the control of the Committee of 300. Space weapons of all former nations shall be destroyed along with nuclear weapons. All essential and non-essential pharmaceutical products, doctors, dentists and healthcare workers will be registered in the Central Computer Data Bank, and no medicine or medical care will be prescribed without express permission of regional controllers responsible for each city, town and village. The United States will be flooded by peoples of alien cultures who will eventually overwhelm white America, people with no concept of what the United States Constitution stands for and who will, in consequence, do nothing to defend it, and in whose minds the concept of liberty and justice is so weak as to matter little. Food and shelter shall be the main concern. No central bank except the Bank of International Settlement and the World Bank shall be allowed to operate. Private banks will be outlawed. Remuneration for work performed shall be under a uniform predetermined scale throughout the one world government. There shall be no wager disputes allowed, nor any diversion from the standard uniform scales of pay laid down by the one world government. Those who break the law will be instantly executed. There shall be no cash or coinage in the hands of the non-elite. All transactions shall be carried out by means of a debit card which shall bear the identification number of the holder. Any person who in any way infringes the rules and regulations of the Committee of 300 shall have the use of his or her card suspended for varying times according to the nature and severity of the infringement. Such persons will find, when they go to make purchases, that their card is blacklisted and they will not be able to obtain services of any kind. Attempts to trade old coins, that is to say silver coins of previous and now defunct nations, shall be treated as a capital crime subject to the death penalty. All such coinage shall be required to be surrendered within a given time along with guns, rifles, explosives and automobiles. Only the elite and one world government high-ranking functionaries will be allowed private transport, weapons, coinage and automobiles. If the offense is a serious one, the card will be seized at the checking point where it is presented. Thereafter that person shall not be able to obtain food, water, shelter and employment medical services, and shall be officially listed as an outlaw. Large bands of outlaws will thus be created and they will live in regions that best afford subsistence, subject to being hunted down and shot on sight. Persons assisting outlaws in any way whatsoever, shall likewise be shot. Outlaws who fail to surrender to the police or military after a declared period of time, shall have a former family member selected at random to serve prison terms in their stead. Rival factions and groups such as Arabs and Jews and African tribes shall have differences magnified and be allowed to wage wars of extermination against each other, under the eyes of NATO and UN observers. The same tactics will be used in Central and South America. These wars of attrition shall take place before the takeover of the one world government and shall be engineered on every continent where large groups of people with ethnic and religious differences live, such as the Sikhs, Muslim Pakistanis and the Hindu Indians. Ethnic and religious differences shall be magnified and exacerbated, and violent conflict as a means of settling their differences shall be encouraged and fostered. All information services and print media shall be under the control of the one world government. Regular brainwashing control measures shall be passed off as entertainment in the manner in which it was practiced and became a fine art in the United States. Youths removed from disloyal parents shall receive special education designed to brutalize them. Youth of both sexes shall receive training to qualify as prison guards for the one world labor camp system. It is obvious from the foregoing that much work remains to be done before the dawning of the New World Order can occur. That the Committee of 300 has long ago perfected plans to destabilize civilization as we know it,
some of which plans were made known by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his classic work The Technotronic Era and the works of Aurellio Peccei, who founded the Club of Rome, especially in his book, The Chasm Ahead. In The Chasm Ahead, Peccei spelled out committee of 300 plans to tame man, whom he called the enemy. Peccei quoted what Felix Dzerzhinsky once said to Sidney Reilly at the height of the Red Terror when millions of Russians were being murdered: "Why should I concern myself with how many die? Even the Christian Bible says, what is man that God should be mindful of him? For me, men are nothing but a brain at one end and a shit factory at the other." It was from this brutish view of man that Emmanuel the Christ came to rescue the world. Sidney Reilly was the MI6 operative sent to watch over Dzerzhinsky's activities. Reilly was allegedly shot by his friend Felix while attempting to flee Russia. The elaborate plot was devised when certain members of the British Parliament raised a hue and cry and began to loudly demand an accounting of Reilly's activities in Russia, which threatened to expose the role of the Committee of 300 in gaining control of the Baku oil fields and its major role in assisting Lenin and Trotsky during the Bolshevik Revolution. Rather than have the truth dragged out of Reilly, MI6 thought it expedient to stage his death. Reilly lived out his days in utter luxury in a Russian villa usually reserved for the Bolshevik elite. Arguing that chaos would ensue unless the Atlantic Alliance, a euphemism for the Committee of 300, ruled post-industrial America, Peccei proposed a Malthusian rigging on a global scale. He envisioned a collision between the scientific technological military apparatus of the Soviet Union and the Western world. Thus the Warsaw Pact countries were to be offered a convergence with the West in a one-world government to run global affairs on the foundations of crisis management and global planning. Events unfolding in what was formerly the USSR and the emergence of several independent states in a loose federation in Russia, is exactly what was envisaged by Peccei and the Club of Rome, and this is clearly spelled out in both the books I have mentioned. A USSR thus divided will be easier to cope with than a strong, united Soviet nation. Plans that were laid down by the Committee of 300 for a one-world government, which included the prospect of a divided Russia, are now approaching a point of rapid escalation. Events in Russia at the close of 1991 are all the more dramatic when viewed against the 1960 long-range planning by the Committee of 300. In Western Europe, the people are working toward a federation of states within a one-government framework with a single currency. From the EEC system will be transferred bit by bit to the United States and Canada. The United Nations is being slowly but surely transformed into a rubber stamp of one world government, with policies dictated to it by the United States, as we saw in the case of the Gulf War. Precisely the same thing is happening with the British Parliament. Discussion on Britain's participation in the Gulf War was kept to a ridiculously minimal level and belatedly took place only during a motion to adjourn the House. This has never happened before in the ancient history or Parliament, where so important a decision had to be made and so little time was allowed for discussion. One of the most noteworthy events in parliamentary history has gone virtually unnoticed. And the word of the IAM came unto me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the prophets of Israel that prophesy, and say thou unto them that prophesy out of their own hearts, Hear ye the word of the IAM. Thus saith the Lord IAM, Woe unto the foolish prophets, politicians, that follow their own spirit, and have seen nothing. O Israel, Britain and USA, the two witnesses and related nations, thy prophets, politicians, are like the foxes in the deserts, Operation Desert Fox. Ye have not gone up into the gaps, neither made up the hedge for the house of Israel, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, which include and are led by America and Britain, to stand in the battle in the day of the IAM, Armageddon. They have seen vanity and lying divination, saying, The IAM saith, and the IAM hath not sent them, and they have made others to hope that their words would be confirmed. Have ye not seen a vain vision, and have ye not spoken a lying divination, whereas ye say, The IAM saith it, albeit I have not spoken? Therefore thus saith the Lord IAM, because ye have spoken vanity, and seen lies, therefore, behold,
I am against you, saith the Lord I am. And mine hand shall be upon the prophets, politicians, that see vanity, and that divine lies. They shall not be in the assembly of my people, neither shall they be written in the writing of the house of Israel, neither shall they enter into the land of Israel, and ye shall know that I am the Lord I am. Even because they have seduced my people, saying, peace, and there was no peace, and one built up a wall, U.no. And NATO, and, lo, others daubed it with untempered mortar, say unto them which daub it with untempered mortar, that it shall fall, there shall be an overflowing shower, and ye, O great hailstones, shall fall, and a stormy wind, Operation Desert Storm, shall rend it. Lo, when the wall is fallen, shall it not be said unto you, where is the daubing wherewith ye have daubed it? Therefore thus saith the Lord I am, I will even rend it with a stormy wind in my fury, and there shall be an overflowing shower in mine anger, and great hailstones in my fury to consume it. So will I break down the wall, that ye have daubed with untempered mortar, and bring it down to the ground, so that their Illuminati, Olympian, foundation thereof shall be discovered, and it shall fall, and ye shall be consumed in the midst thereof, and ye shall know that I am the I am. Thus will I accomplish my wrath upon the wall, UNO, and NATO, and upon them that have daubed it with untempered mortar, and will say unto you, the wall is no more, neither they that daubed it. God, Ezekiel 13:1-15. We are close to the point where the United States will send its military forces to settle any and all disputes brought before the United Nations. Departing Secretary-General Peres de Cuellar, heavily laden with bribe money, was the most compliant UN leader in history in granting demands of the United States without discussion. His successor will be even more inclined to go along with whatever the U.S. government places before him. This is an important step along the road to a one-world government. The International Court of Justice at The Hague will be used in increasing measure in the next 2 years to settle legal arguments of all types. It is of course the prototype for a one-world government legal system that will supplant all others. As for central banks, essential in the planning of the New World Order, this is already very much a fait accompli, with the Bank of International Settlements dominating the scene at the close of 1991. Private banks are fast disappearing in preparation for the Big Ten banks that will control banking the world over under the guidance of BIS and the IMF. Welfare states abound in Europe, and the United States is fast becoming the largest welfare state in the world. Once people come to depend on government for their subsistence, it will be very hard to wean them away from it, as we saw in the results of the last midterm election held in the United States, where 98% of incumbents were returned to Washington to enjoy the good life in spite of their utterly deplorable records. The abolition of privately owned firearms is already in force in 3/4 of the world. Only in the United States can the populace still own guns of all types, but that legal right is being chipped away at an alarming rate by local and state laws which violate the constitutional right of all citizens to bear arms. Private gun ownership will have become a thing of the past in the United States by the year 2010. Similarly, education is being eroded at an alarming rate. Private schools are being forced to close by a variety of legal stratagems and lack of funding. The standard of education in the United States has already sunk to such a deplorable level that today it can barely be classified as education at all. This is according to plan, as I described earlier. The one-world government does not want our youth to be properly educated. Destruction of national identity proceeds apace. It is no longer a good thing to be patriotic, unless it is in the cause of some one-world government project, such as the war of genocide being waged against the nation of Iraq, or the impending destruction of Libya. Racial pride is now frowned upon and deemed to be an illegal act in many parts of the world, including the United States, Britain, Western Europe and Canada, all countries having the largest concentrations of the white race. Led by the secret societies in America, Destruction of republican forms of government has proceeded apace since the close of World War II. A list of such governments destroyed by the U.S. is long, and it is difficult for the non-informed to accept that government of a country, allegedly wedded to republicanism under a unique constitution, would engage in such conduct, but the facts speak for themselves. This is a goal which was set, over a century ago, by the Committee of 300. The United States has led the attacks on such governments and continues to do so, even as the United States Republican base is being steadily undermined. Starting with James Earl Carter's legal counsel, Lloyd Cutler, a committee of constitutional lawyers has been working to change the U.S. Congress into a non-representative parliamentary system. Work has been in progress since 1979 on the blueprint for such a change, and because of his devotion to the cause, Cutler was made a member of the Committee of 300. The final draft for a parliamentary type of government is to be presented to the Committee of 300 at the end of 1993. In the new parliamentary system, members will not be responsible to their constituents, but to parliamentary whips and will vote the way they are told to vote. Thus, by judicial and bureaucratic subversion the Constitution will vanish, as will individual liberty. Pre-planned degrading of man through licentious sexual practices will be stepped up. New sexually degenerate cults are even now being set up by the British Crown, working through the SIS and MI6 services. As we already know, all cults operating in the world today are the product of British intelligence, acting for the oligarchical rulers. We may think this phase of creating a whole new cult which specializes in sexual degenerate behavior is still far off, but my information is that it is due to be stepped up in 1992. By 1994 it will be quite commonplace to have live shows in the most prestigious clubs and places of entertainment. This type of entertainment is already in the process of having its image cleaned and brightened. Soon the big names in Hollywood and the entertainment world will be recommending this or that club as a must for live sex shows. Lesbianism and homosexuality will not be featured. This new socially acceptable entertainment will consist of heterosexual displays and will be written up in reviews as one finds in today's newspapers about shows on Broadway, or the latest hit movie. An unprecedented assault on moral values will go into high gear in 1992. Pornography will no longer be called pornography, but adult sex entertainment. Sloganeering will take the form of "why hide it when everybody does it?" Let's take away the image that public displays of sex are ugly and dirty. No more will those who care for this type of unbridled sexual lust have to go to seedy porno parlors. Instead, the upper-class supper clubs and places favored by the rich and famous will make public sexual displays a highly artistic form of entertainment. Worse yet, some church leaders will even recommend it. The voluminous all-pervading and enormous social psychiatry apparatus put in place by the Tavistock Institute and its huge web of related capabilities has been under the control of one single entity, and that entity is still in control as we enter 1992. That single entity, the conspirators' hierarchy, is called the Committee of 300. It is a power structure and a power center that operates far beyond the reach of any single world leader or any government, including the United States government and its presidents, as the late John F. Kennedy found out. The Kennedy murder was an operation of the Committee of 300 and we shall return to that. The Committee of 300 is the ultimate secret society made up of an untouchable ruling class, which includes the Queen of England, the Queen of the Netherlands, the Queen of Denmark and the royal families of Europe. These aristocrats decided at the death of Queen Victoria, the matriarch of the Venetian Black Guelphs, that, in order to gain worldwide control, it would be necessary for its aristocratic members to go into business with the non-aristocratic but extremely powerful leaders of corporate business on a global scale, and so the doors to ultimate power were opened to what the Queen of England likes to refer to as the commoners. From my days in the intelligence business I know that heads of foreign governments refer to this all-powerful body as the magicians. Stalin coined his own phrase to describe them, the dark forces, and President Eisenhower, who was never able to get beyond the Hofjuden, Cortu, grade, referred to it in a colossal understatement as the military-industrial complex. Stalin kept the USSR heavily armed with conventional and nuclear forces because he did not trust what he called the family. His ingrained mistrust and fear of the Committee of 300 proved to be well-founded. Popular entertainment, especially the medium of movie-making, was used to bring discredit upon those who tried to warn of this most dangerous threat to individual liberty and freedom of mankind. Freedom is a God-given law which man has constantly sought to subvert and undermine, yet the yearning for freedom by each individual is so great that up to now, no system has been able to tear that feeling from the heart of man. The experiments that have gone on in the USSR, Britain and the USA, to blunt and dull man's yearnings for freedom, have thus far proved to be unsuccessful. But with the coming of the New World Order one world government, far-reaching experiments will be stepped up to drive man's God-given yearning for freedom out of his mind, body and soul. What we are already experiencing is but nothing, a mere bagatelle, when compared with what is to come. Attacking the soul is the thrust of a host of experiments being readied, and I regret to say that institutions in the United States will play a leading role in the terrible experiments which have already been carried out on local small-scale levels at such places as Bethesda Naval Hospital and Vacaville Prison in California. The movies we have seen thus far include the James Bond series, the Assassination Bureau, the Matt Harry's Circle and so on. They were make-believe movies, designed to hide the truth that such organizations do exist and on a far greater scale than even Hollywood's fertile idea men could dream up. Yet the Assassination Bureau is absolutely real. It exists in Europe and the United States solely to do the bidding of the Committee of 300 to carry out high-level assassinations where all other remedies have failed. It was Pemindex which ran the Kennedy assassination under the direction of Sir William Stevenson, for years the Queen of England's #1 pest control operative. Clay Shaw, a contract agent of the CIA, ran Pemindex out of the Trade Mart Center in New Orleans. Former New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison came very close to cracking the Kennedy assassination plot up to the level of Clay Shaw until Garrison was dealt with and Shaw was found not guilty of involvement in the Kennedy assassination plot. The fact that Shaw was eliminated in the manner of Jack Ruby, another CIA contract agent, both died of induced quick-acting cancer, speaks volumes that Garrison was on the right track. Jack Ruby died of cancer in prison. In January 1967, a second assassination bureau is located in Switzerland and was, until recently, run by a shadowy figure of whom no photographs existed after 1941. The operations were and probably still are financed by the Ultramer family, Swiss black nobility, owners of the Lombardia Bank of Geneva, or the Committee of 300 operation. The primary contact man was Jacques Stell. This according to U.S. Army G2 intelligence files. This group was also closely allied with Alan Dulles and Jean de Manil, an important member of the Committee of 300 and a very prominent name in the oil industry in Texas. Army G2 records show that the group was heavily involved in the arms trade in the Middle East, but more than that, the Assassination Bureau made no less than 30 attempts to assassinate General de Gaulle, in which Jacques Stell was directly involved. The same Stell was the contact man for the Sendero Luminosa Shining Pathway guerrilla group protecting the committee's Peruvian Cogna producers. When all of the best that the Assassination Bureau could do had failed, thanks to the excellent work done by DGSE, French intelligence formerly STIS, the job was assigned to MI6, Military Intelligence Department 6, and also known as Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, under the code name Jackal. STIS employed clever young graduates and was not infiltrated by MI6 or the KGB to any measurable extent. Its record in tracking down foreign agents made it the envy of the secret services of every nation, and it was this group that followed Jackal to his final destination and then killed him before he could fire on General de Gaulle's motorcade. It was the STIS who uncovered a Soviet mole in the cabinet of de Gaulle, who also happened to be a liaison man with the CIA in Langley. In order to discredit the STIS, Alan Dulles, who hated de Gaulle, the feeling was mutual, had one of its agents, Roger Delouet, caught with $12 million worth of heroin in his possession. After a great deal of expert interrogation, Delouet confessed but was unable to say why he was smuggling drugs into the United States. The whole thing stank to high heaven of a setup. Based upon an examination of Stee's methods in protecting de Gaulle, especially in motorcades, the FBI, Secret Service and the CIA knew exactly how to strip President Kennedy of his security and make it easy for the three Pomindex shooters to murder him in Dealey Plaza in November 1963. Another example of fact disguised as fiction is the Leon Aris novel, Topaz. In Topaz we find a factual account of the activities of Thyroid Vosjeli, the very KGB agent uncovered by Stees and denounced as the KGB's liaison man with the CIA. There are many fictionalized accounts of the Mossad's activities, nearly all of which are based on fact. The Mossad is also known as the Institute. Many would-be writers make nonsensical statements about it, especially one writer who is much in favor with the Christian right wing, which is accepted as truth. One can pardon the offender because he has no intelligence training, but that does not stop him from dropping Mossad names all over the place. Such disinformation exercises are routinely run against American right-wing patriotic groups. Originally the Mossad consisted of three groups: the Bureau of Military Intelligence, the Political Department of the Foreign Office and the Department of Security, Sharat Habitukan. David Ben-Gurion, a member of the Committee of 300, received some considerable help from MI6 in putting it together, but it was not a success, and in 1951 Sir William Stevenson of MI6 restructured it into a single unit as arm of the political department of the Israeli Foreign Office, with a special operations group for espionage and black job operations. British intelligence gave further assistance in training and equipping for servicing the Sarat Mektal, also known as the General Staff Reconnaissance Unit, in the format of Britain's Special Air Service, SAS. This service unit of the Mossad is never mentioned by name and is known simply as the Guys. The Guys are merely an extension of British intelligence's SAS unit, who continually train and update them in new methods. It was the Guys who killed the leaders of the P.L.0 and kidnapped Adolf Eichmann. The Guys, and indeed all Mossad agents, operate on a wartime footing. The Mossad has a tremendous advantage over other intelligence services in that every country in the world has a large Jewish community. By studying social and criminal records, the Mossad is able to pick agents among local Jews it can have a hold over and make them work for it without pay. The Mossad also has the advantage of having access to the records of all U.S. law enforcement agencies and U.S. intelligence services. The Office of Naval Intelligence, OMT, services the Mossad at no cost to Israel. Citizens of the United States would be shocked, angered and dismayed if ever it was discovered just how much the Mossad knows about the lives of millions of Americans, in every walk of life, even those who are not political in any way. The first head of the Mossad, Reuben Shiloch, was made a member of the Committee of 300, but it is not known whether his successor enjoyed the same privilege. Chances are that he does. The Mossad has a skillful disinformation service. The amount of disinformation it feeds to the American market is embarrassing, but even more embarrassing is how it is swallowed, hook, line and sinker, and all. What we are actually witnessing in the microcosm of the Mossad is the extent of control exercised by the Olympians via the intelligence services, entertainment, publishing, opinion-making, polls, and the television news media on a global scale. Ted Turner was recently given a seat on the Committee of 300 in recognition for his news-making, CNN broadcasts. The committee has the power and the means to tell the people of this world anything, and it will be believed by the vast majority, on every occasion that a researcher happens upon this astounding central control group. He is either successfully bought off, or else he undergoes some specialty training at the Tavistock Institute, after which he becomes a contributor to more fiction, of the James Bond type, that is, he is derailed and well rewarded. If such a person as John F. Kennedy should stumble onto the truth about who directs world events, and cannot be bought, he is assassinated. In the case of John F. Kennedy, the assassination was carried out with great attendant publicity and with the utmost brutality to serve as a warning to world leaders not to get out of line. Pope John Paul I was quietly murdered because he was getting close to the Committee of 300 through Freemasons in the Vatican hierarchy. His successor, Pope John Paul II, was publicly humiliated as a warning to cease and desist, which he has done. As we shall see, certain Vatican leaders are today seated on the Committee of 300. It is easy to put serious researchers off track of the Committee of 300 because Britain's MI6, CIS, promotes a wide variety of cookery, such as the New Age, Yogaism, Zen Buddhism, witchcraft, Delphic priesthood of Apollo, Aristotle was a member, and hundreds of small cults of all kinds. A group of retired British intelligence agents who stayed on the track labelled the conspirators' hierarchy for sex, and declared that it possesses a superintelligence service that has corrupted the KGB, the Vatican intelligence, the CIA, the DGSE, U.S. military intelligence, the State Department Intelligence Service and even the most secret of all U.S. intelligence agencies, the Office of National Reconnaissance. The existence of the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, was known to only a handful of people outside of the Committee of 300, until Truman stumbled upon it quite by accident. Churchill had a hand in setting up the NRO and he was reportedly livid when Truman discovered its existence. Churchill, more than any other servant of the Committee of 300, considered Truman, his little man from independence without an independence at all. This referred to Truman's every move being controlled by Freemasonry. Even today, NRO's annual budget is not known to the Congress of the United States, and it is responsible to only a selected few in Congress. But it is a creature of the Committee of 300 to whom its reports are routinely sent every few hours. Thus the fictionalized spoofs one sees about the various branches and arms of control of the committee were designed to take suspicion away from the real thing. But we should never doubt that the real thing does indeed exist. Take another example of what I mean, the book The Day of the Jackal, from which a highly successful movie was created. The events related in the book are factual. Although for obvious reasons the names of some of the players and the locales were changed, but the thrust of the story, that a single MI6 operative was assigned to get rid of General Charles de Gaulle, is absolutely correct. General de Gaulle had become unmanageable, refusing to cooperate with the committee, whose existence he knew very well, since he had been invited to join it, came to a climax when de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO and immediately began building his own nuclear force, the so-called Force de Frappe. This so angered the committee that de Gaulle's assassination was ordered. But the French Secret Intelligence Service was able to intercept Jackal's plans and keep de Gaulle safe. In the light of the record of MI6, which I might add is the Committee of 300's main resource when it comes to intelligence, the work done by French intelligence borders on the miraculous. Military Intelligence Department 6 dates back to Sir Francis Walsingham, paymaster of Queen Elizabeth I for dirty tricks operations. Over hundreds of years, MI6 has established a record which no other intelligence agency can come near to duplicating. MI6 agents have gathered information from the four corners of the earth and have carried out secret operations that would astound even the most knowledgeable if ever they were to be made public, which is why it rates as the master service of the Committee of 300. Officially, MI6 does not exist, its budget comes out of the Queen's purse and private funds, and is reported to be in a range of $350 to $500 million per annum. But no one knows for sure what the exact amount is. In its present form, MI6 dates back to 1911, when it was under the leadership of Sir Mansfield Cumming, a captain in the Royal Navy, who was always identified by the letter C, from which M of James Bond fame is taken. No official record of MI6's failures and successes exist, it is that secret. Although the Burgess McLean Blake Blunt disasters did great damage to the morale of MI6 officers. Unlike other services, Future members are recruited from universities and other areas of learning by highly skilled talent scouts, as we saw in the case of Rhodes scholars inducted into the Roundtable. One of the requirements is an ability to speak foreign languages. Candidates undergo a rigorous blooding. With the backing of such a formidable force, the Committee of 300 had little fear from ever being exposed, and this will go on for decades. What makes the committee incredible is the incredible secrecy that prevails. None of the news media has ever made mention of this conspiratorial hierarchy, therefore, as is to be expected, people doubt its existence.